Listening Library presents The Mirror of Merlin, Book 4 of The Lost Years of Merlin by T.A. Barron. Read for you by Kevin Isola, with a note from the author.
Hi, this is T.A. Barron. One thing never changes about Merlin. He continues to surprise. That is true in the earliest tales first sung by Welsh bards 15 centuries ago, and it is no less so today. It is true in Merlin's fabled elder years, when he becomes the mentor to King Arthur, mage of the Round Table, and central figure in the wondrous tragedy we call Camelot. And it is no less true in Merlin's youth, as he struggles to find his own name, his own self, and his own destiny. Perhaps his knack for surprise flows from the sheer depth and complexity of his character. As merely one of the latest in a long line of Merlin's chroniclers, I am struck by how much of his character, after 15 centuries, remains still unexplored. Perhaps it stems from the powerful magic that starts to emerge within him during his youth. Or perhaps from the mysterious future that awaits him, as alluring as it is terrifying. Or his ability to surprise may flow from something far more simple, far more basic: Merlin's own humanity. In this volume, the fourth in the Lost Years of Merlin epic, his surprises come less from his swelling gifts and dawning greatness than from his fundamental human frailties. For all his growing powers and growing passions, he remains a mortal man. To be sure, Merlin has come a long way from that fateful day that began the saga of his lost years. On that day, a bedraggled, half-drowned boy washed ashore on a strange coastline. Almost instantly, death pursued him. Yet, for all the fears that filled his thoughts, he felt mainly aware of what he lacked. He had no memory of his childhood, his parents, nor even his own name. It was, in his own words, a day harsh, cold, and lifeless, as empty of promise as my lungs were empty of air. Although Merlin survived that day, his more challenging journey had only just begun. Since then, he has discovered some of the secrets of Finkyra, a land as elusive as the mist that swirls about its borders, an island resting in between mortal Earth and the immortal Otherworld. He has learned much about his past, though less about his identity. He has found his parents and the truth about his birth. He has gained a few friends, and lost a few as well. And Merlin has succeeded on other fronts. He has healed a wounded dragon, run like a deer, spawned the dance of the giants, discovered a new way of seeing, solved the riddle of the 7 songs, heard the whispers of an ancient shell, survived being swallowed by a living stone, taken the spirit of his sister into himself, and borne her to the other world, triumphed over creatures who devour magic, and mastered the legendary Wheel of Why. He has built a musical instrument of his own design, and realized that its music lay less in the strings than in the hands that plucked them. Yet despite all his successes, Merlin's greatest challenges lie ahead. He must somehow come to understand the depth of his own humanness, its capacity for triumph, and also for tragedy. How else can he ever become in his later years that mentor to King Arthur we know so well? To play his part in the Arthurian cycle, and in the even grander cycle of myth that stretches long before and after, Merlin must know humanity well, immensely well. He must know our highest aspirations, as well as our deepest frailties. He must understand that even the best intentions may be riddled with flaws, that even promised salvation may hold serious dangers. He must, in short, know himself. But how to see himself in the truest mirror? And where might such a mirror be found? Perhaps its reflections are seen in disparate places, if only in disguised form. Perhaps its images, whether highly luminous or deeply shadowed, hold some surprises of their own.
In misty dreams and shadowed memories of fabled cities I have dwelt apace. In crystal splendor I have spanned the seas and clothed myself in legendary grace. From a 6th century poem, Song of Diphydiath. The world from which the stories came lies still within the astral mists. W.B. Yeats. Prologue. Many are the mirrors I have examined, many are the faces I have seen, yet for all these years, lo, all these centuries, there is but one mirror with one visage I cannot forget. It has haunted me from the start, from that very first instant, and it haunts me no less to this day. Mirrors, I assure you, can cause more pain than broadswords, more terror than ghouls. Under the stone archway, mist billowed and swirled, roving about like an all-seeing eye. The mist did not rise from the ground or from some steaming pool nearby. Rather, this mist formed out of the very air under the arch, behind the strange, quivering curtain that held it back, as a dam might hold a swelling tide. Even so, the vapors often pushed past, licking the purple-leafed vines that wrapped around the pillars. But more often, as now, they churned deep within the archway, forming and dissolving shapes in endless procession, ever changing, ever the same. Then, without warning, the curtain of mist shuddered, hardening into a flat sheet. Beams of light struck its surface, breaking apart like shards of glass, vague shapes from the surrounding marshes reflected there. Somewhere, behind the reflections, clouds continued to churn, touched by dark, distorted shadows, and a mysterious light glinting from the depths beyond. For this curtain was truly a mirror, one filled with mist, and more. A mirror with its own movement, its own pulse. A mirror with something stirring far beneath its surface. Suddenly, from the very center came a waft of vapors, followed by something else, something slender, and twisted, and alive. Something very much like a hand. With long nails, sharper than claws, the fingers reached outward, groping. 3 of them, then a 4th, then a thumb. Wisps of mist from the marsh curled around them, adorning them with delicate, lace-like rings. But the fingers shook free before closing into a fist. For a long moment, the fist squeezed itself tightly, as if testing its own reality. The skin, nearly as pale as the surrounding vapors, went whiter still. The fingernails dug deeper into the flesh. All over, the fist quivered from strain. Ever so slowly, the hand started to relax. The fingers uncurled, flexed, and worked the air. Hazy threads wove themselves around the thumb and stretched across the open palm. At the same time, the mirror itself darkened. From the edges of the crumbling stones, deep shadows seeped inward, covering the surface. In a few moments, the whole archway gleamed like a black crystal, its smooth surface unbroken but for the pale hand squirming in its center. A sharp creaking split the air. It might have come from the mirror, or the ancient stones themselves, or somewhere else entirely. With it came a scent, compellingly sweet, akin to rose blossoms. A wind stirred, carrying away both the sound and the perfume. both vanished into the rancid terrain of the haunted marsh. No one, not even the marsh ghouls themselves, noticed what had happened, nor did anyone witness what happened next. The hand, fingers splayed wide, lunged forward. Behind it came the wrist, forearm, and elbow. The gleaming surface suddenly shattered, melting back into a shifting, quivering mirror, as restless as the mists within its depths. Out of the archway strode a woman. As she planted her boots on the muddy ground, she smoothed the creases on her white robe and silver-threaded shawl. Tall and slender she stood, with eyes as lightless as the interior of a stone. Glancing back at the mirror, she smiled grimly. She gave her black, flowing locks a shake and turned her attention to the marsh. For a long moment she listened to its distant wailing and hissing. Then she grunted in satisfaction. Under her breath she whispered, "This time, my dear Merlin, you shall not elude me." With that, she gathered her shawl about her shoulders and strode off into the gloom. Part 1. Chapter 1. Shadows. I strained, throwing all my strength into the task, but my shadow refused to move. Again I tried. Still, the stubborn shadow would not budge. Closing my eyes, a meaningless gesture since they couldn't see anyway, having been replaced by my second sight over 3 years ago, I tried my best to concentrate, to perceive nothing but my shadow. That was not easy on a bright summer day like this, though it still seemed easier than my task. All right then. Clearing my mind, I pushed aside the sound of rustling grasses on this alpine meadow, and of splattering stream water nearby. No smells of spring mint or lavender or pepperwort, almost strong enough to make me sneeze. No boulder, roughened by yellow lichens, resting beneath me. No mountains of variegal, streaked with snow even in summer, rising above me. No wondering about whether I might encounter my old friend, the giant Shim, in these hills so near his home. And most difficult of all, no drifting into thoughts about Halia. Just my shadow. Starting from the bottom, I traced the shadow's outline on the grass. There were my boots, leather straps dangling, planted firmly on top of the boulder. Then my legs, hips, and chest, looking less scrawny than usual because of my billowing tunic. Protruding from one side, my leather satchel, and from the other, my sword. Next, my arms, bent with hands resting on hips, and my head turned sideways just enough to show the tip of my nose, which, much to my consternation, had started to hook downward in recent months. Already more beak than nose, it reminded me of the hawk who had inspired my name. Then, of course, came my hair, even blacker than my shadow, and, I grumbled to myself, just as unruly. "Move," I commanded silently, all the while keeping my own body motionless. No response. "Lift yourself," I intoned, focusing all my thoughts on the shadow's right arm. Still no response. I released a growl. Already I had wasted the entire morning trying to coax it to move independently. So what if shadow working was a skill reserved only for the eldest wizards, true mages? I never was much good at waiting. I drew a long, slow breath. "Lift! Lift, I say!" For a long moment I stared, exasperated, at the dark form. Then something started to change. Slowly, very slowly, the shadow's outline started to quiver. The edges of its shoulders grew blurry, while its arms quaked so violently they seemed to swell in size. Better, much better. I forced myself not to move, not even to brush away the bothersome drops of perspiration rolling down my temples. "Now, right arm. Lift yourself." With a sharp jerk, the shadow's arm straightened and lifted all the way above the head. Though I held my own body fixed, a thrill raced through me, a mixture of excitement and discovery and pride in my growing powers. At last I had done it, worked my own shadow. I could hardly wait to show Halia. Though I felt as if I could fly off the boulder, I kept myself still. Only my widening grin betrayed my feelings. Returning my attention to the shadow, its arm still raised, I savoured my success. To think that I, barely 15 years of age, could move my shadow's left arm. My whole chest constricted. It should have moved to the right, not the left. With a roar, I stomped my boots and waved my own arms angrily. The shadow, as if in spite, did the same back at me. "You foolish shadow! I'll teach you some obedience." "And when will that be?" asked a resonant voice behind me. I spun around to face Halia. Stepping as lightly as a doe, she seemed more supple than the summer grass. Yet I knew that, even in her young woman's form, she was ever alert to any possible danger, ready to run like the deer she could become in an instant. As the sunlight glinted on her auburn braid, her immense brown eyes watched me with humour. "Obedience, if I recall, isn't one of your strong points." "Not me, my shadow." Her eyes sparkled mischievously. "Where leaps the stag, so leaps his shadow." But I—" My cheeks grew hotter as I stammered. "Why do you have to appear right now, just when I've botched everything?" She stroked her long chin. "If I didn't know better, I might think you had been hoping to impress me." "Not at all." I clenched my fists, then shook them at my shadow. Seeing it wave its own fists back at me only made me angrier. Fool shadow, I just want to make it do what it should. Halia bent to study a sprig of lupine, as deep purple as her robe. "And I just want to keep you a little humble." She sniffed the tower of petals. "That's usually Rhea's responsibility. But since she's off learning the speech of the canyon eagles—" "With my horse to carry her," I grumbled, trying to stretch my stiff shoulders. "True enough." She glanced up and smiled, more with her eyes than with her lips. "She can't, after all, run like a deer." Something about her words, her tone, her smile, made my anger vanish like mist in the morning sun. Even my shoulders seemed to relax. How, I couldn't begin to explain. Yet all at once, I recalled the secrets she had shown me of transforming myself into a deer, as well as the joys of running beside her, with hooves instead of feet, forelegs instead of two, with keen sight and keener smell, with the ability to hear not just through my ears, but through my very bones. It's, I stammered. "Nice, I suppose, to be here. With you, I mean. Just you." Her doe-like eyes, suddenly shy, turned aside. Emboldened, I climbed down from the rock. Even in these days, these weeks we've been travelling together, we haven't had much time alone. Tentatively, I reached for her hand. "If it hasn't been one of your dear people, or some old friend, it's been—" She jerked her hand away. "So you haven't liked what I've shown you?" "No, I mean, yes, that's not what I'm saying. You know how much I've loved being here, seeing your people's summer lands, those high meadows, the birthing hollow, all the hidden trails through the trees. It's just that, well, the best part has been—" As my voice faltered, she cocked her head. "Yes?" I glanced her way, meeting her gaze for barely an instant, but it was enough to make me forget what I had wanted to say. "Yes," she coaxed. "Tell me, young hawk." "It's, been— Fumble feathers, I don't know." My brow furrowed. "Sometimes I envy old Care-Pray, tossing off poems whenever he likes." She half grinned. These days, it's mostly love poems to your mother. More flustered than ever, I exclaimed, "That's not what I meant." Then, seeing her face fall, I realized my gaffe. I mean, when I said that, what I meant was not what I meant to say. She merely shook her head. Again, I stretched my hand toward her. "Please, Halia, don't judge me by my words." She grunted. "Then how should I judge you?" "By something else." "Like what?" A sudden inspiration seized me. I grasped her hand, pulling her across the grass. Together we ran, our feet pounding in unison. As we neared the edge of the stream, our backs lowered, our necks lengthened, our arms stretched down to the ground. The bright green reeds by the water's edge, glistening with dew, bent before us. In one motion, one body it seemed, we sprang into the air, flowing as smoothly as the stream below us. We landed on the opposite bank, fully transformed into deer. Swinging about, I reared back on my haunches and drew a deep breath, filling my nostrils with the rich aromas of the meadow and the full-hearted freedom of a stag. Halia's foreleg brushed against my own. I replied with a stroke of an antler across her graceful neck. An instant later, we were bounding together through the grass, prancing with hooves high, listening to the whispering reeds and the many secret murmurs of the meadow. For a time, measured not in minutes but in magic, we cavorted. When at last we stopped, our tan coats shone with sweat. We trotted to the stream, browsed for a while on the shoots by the bank, then stepped lightly into the shallows. As we walked upstream, our backs lifted higher, our heads taller. Soon we were no longer wading with our hooves, but with our feet. Mine booted, Halia's bare. In silence we clambered up the muddy bank and stepped through the rushes. When we reached the boulder, scene of my unsuccessful shadow working, Halia faced me, her doe eyes still alight. "I have something to tell you, young hawk. Something important." I watched her, my heart pounding like a great hoof within my chest. She started to speak, then caught herself. It's so hard to put into words." "I understand, believe me." Gently, I ran my finger down her arm. "Later, perhaps." Hesitantly, she tried again. "No, now. I've been wanting to say this for a while, and the feeling has grown stronger with every day we've spent in the summer lands." "Yes?" I paused, trying to swallow. "What is it?" She edged a bit closer. "I want you to know something, young hawk." "Know what?" "That you—" Suddenly, a heavy object rammed into me, knocking me over backward. I rolled across the grass, stopping only at the edge of the stream. After untangling myself from my tunic, which had somehow wrapped itself around my head and shoulders, I leapt to my feet with a spray of mud. Grimacing, I grasped the hilt of my sword and faced my attacker. But instead of lunging forward, I groaned. "Not you. Not now." A young dragon, her purple and scarlet scales aglow, sat beside us. She was tucking her leathery wings, still quivering from flight, against her back. Her immense, gangly form obscured the boulder, as well as a fair portion of the meadow, which is why she had sent me sprawling when she landed. Only Halia's quick instincts had spared her the same fate. The dragon drew a deep, ponderous breath. Her head, nearly as large as my entire body, hung remorsefully from her huge shoulders. Even her wings drooped sadly, as did one of her blue, banner-like ears. The other ear, as always, stuck straight out from the side of her head, looking less like an ear than a misplaced horn. Halia, seeing my angry expression, moved protectively to the dragon's side. She placed her hand on the end of the protruding ear. "Gwynnie's sorry, can't you see? She didn't mean any harm." The dragon scrunched her nose and gave a deep, throaty whimper. Halia peered into her orange, triangular eyes. "She's only just learned to fly. Her landings are still a little clumsy." "Little clumsy," I fumed. "She might have killed me." I paced over to my staff, lying on the grass, and brandished it before the dragon's face. "You're as bad as a drunken giant. No, worse. At least he'd pass out eventually. You just keep getting bigger and clumsier by the day." Gwynnia's eyes, glowing like lava, narrowed slightly. From deep within her chest, a rumble gathered, swelling steadily. The dragon suddenly stiffened and cocked her head, as if puzzled by the sound. Then, as the rumble faded away, she opened her gargantuan, teeth-studded jaws in a prolonged yawn. "Be glad she hasn't learned yet how to breathe fire," cautioned Halia. Quickly, she added, "though I'm sure she'd never use it on a friend." She scratched the edge of the rebellious ear. "Would you, Gwynia?" The dragon gave a loud snort. Then, from the other end of the meadow, the barbed end of her tail lifted, curled, and moved swiftly closer. With the grace of a butterfly, the remotest tip of the tail alighted on Halia's shoulder. There it rested, purple scales upon purple cloth, squeezing her gently. Brushing some of the mud from my tunic, I gave an exasperated sigh. "It's hard to stay angry at either of you for long." I gazed into one of the dragon's bright eyes. "Forgive me, will you? I forgot, just for a moment, that you're never far from Halia's side." The young woman turned toward me. "For just a moment," she said softly. "I too forgot." I nodded sadly. "It's no fault of yours." "Oh, but it is." She stroked the golden scales of the barbed tail. "When I started singing to her in the evenings, all those songs I learned as a child, I had no idea she would grow so attached." "Or so large." Halia nearly smiled. "I suppose we should never have let Cairpray give her such a weighty name, out of the ancient dragon lore, unless we expected her to live up to it some day." "That's right. The name of the first queen of the dragons, mother of all their race." I chewed my lip, recalling the old legend. The one who risked her own life to swallow the fire from a great lava mountain so that she and all her descendants might also breathe flames. At that, Gwynia opened her wide jaws and gave another yawn, this time so loud that we both had to cover our ears. When at last the yawn ended, I observed, "Seems like the Queen may need a nap." In a hopeful whisper, I added, "We may get to finish our conversation yet." Halia nodded, even as she shifted uneasily. But before she could say anything, a new sound sliced through the air. It was a high, mournful keening, the kind of sound that could only come from someone in the throes of death. Or, more accurately, someone for whom death itself would be a reprieve. Chapter 2. The Ballymag. The anguished cries from somewhere near the stream continued. Grabbing my staff, I dashed across the grass, followed by Halia. The young dragon merely watched us sleepily, nuzzling her wing with her enormous nose. Even before I reached the bank, I realized that the wailing, so loud that it drowned out the tumble and splatter of water on the stones, was coming from a bend upstream. Halia and I rushed to the spot, pushing aside some yellow gorse that grew by the water's edge. There, struggling to pull itself onto the muddy bank, was the oddest-looking creature I had ever seen. His body was dark, rounded, and sleek, much like the seals of Finkyra's western coast, though smaller in size. Too, he possessed a seal's long whiskers and deep, sorrowful eyes. But instead of fins, this creature had arms, 3 on each side. Thin and bony, the arms each ended with a pair of opposing claws resembling a crab's. From his well-padded belly hung a net of greenish webbing, a pouch, perhaps, while his back held a row of long, delicate tails, each one coiled tightly into a spiral. Then I noticed the jagged cut, caked with mud, that ran down his right flank. As the creature flopped against the bank, Moaning piteously, I knelt beside him. Quickly, splashing him with stream water, I tried to clean the wound. At first, the poor beast, thoroughly consumed by his own suffering, didn't seem to notice me. After a moment, though, he gave a sudden, violent shudder.
"Oh, terriblest pain of death! Horriblest bloody hurt!" he bellowed. "My end finish! So soon, so soon, and I so little young, almost a bear baby."
"Don't worry," I answered soothingly, hopeful that my own dialect sounded less strange to him than his did to me. "I'm sure that cut hurts, but it's really not too deep." I reached into my satchel and pulled out a handful of healing herbs. These herbs
"Ah, for killer cooking, little me, poor me, of course. Such a dreadfulest, woefulest end of finish."
His whole body trembled, especially the thick rolls of fat under his chin.
"How I so very much suffer fled, only to be cook-potted by a cruellest man-monster."
I shook my head. "You don't understand. Try to relax." Dripping some water on the herbs, I patted them into a poultice. "This will help you heal faster, that's all." The creature shrieked and tried to wriggle free.
"Man-monster! You want to fat and chew me up lightning fast. Oh, agony, woe, my pain o' death, so near upon, my—"
"No," I declared. "Calm down, will you?"
"You'll imprison cage me then, tour show me as your oddities beast, so more man-monsters can hurl a stones at my cage, or pinch-a-squeal me through balls. Terriblest fate, horriblest end."
"No!" I tried my best to work the poultice into the wound, but the creature's constant thrashing made it nearly impossible. Several times he nearly slid off my lap into the water, or into the gorse bushes. "I'm here to help you, don't you understand?"
"You? Man-monster? Whenever, never did man-monster do thing any puny bit helpfulest for Ballymag."
"Ballymag?" repeated Halia, bending lower. "Why, indeed he could be." Catching my puzzled look, she explained. "One of the rarest beings on the island. I've only heard stories, but yes, this surely looks like one. Though what he's doing here, I don't understand. I thought they lived only in the remotest marshes."
"In haunted marsh, it's self-certain," wailed the Ballymag. "Out-straighten your fax attacks, before you imprison cage me, crunch-a-beat me, and cook-scald me with 100 dozen stale potatoes. Oh, woefulest world, disheartenest distress."
Shaking my head, I examined the gash again. "Trusting fellow, aren't you?"
"Yes, most certainly," bawled the creature, tears brimming in his round eyes. "My nature born, that is. Too quick-thrusting, too fool-gullible. Always eager ready to find happy hope in any situation I am, which is why it's my sorrow fate to shriek-a-die with stale potatoes, an ass-nasty turn."
The Ballymag drew a slow, unsteady breath.
"Well, go ahead and killer-scream me. I'll crumple-go honorously."
For a full 2 seconds he kept silent. Then, all at once, he bellowed,
"Oh, terror-woe, crampy mess! To be cook-potted now, so little young, so bravely strong, so—"
"Quiet!" I commanded, working myself into a sitting position on the bank. Baring my teeth, I glared at him fiercely. "The louder you protest, the more terrible your death will be." Halia looked at me with surprise, but I ignored her. Yes, oh yes, I cackled murderously. The only question is just how to kill you. But this much is certain. The more you fuss, the more painful I shall make it for you.
Truly, really?
Whimpered the ballymag. Yes, now stop your wailing.
Oh, horribles!
This instant! The beast fell silent, but for the occasional shiver which made him jiggle from the top of his throat down to the bottom of his belly, he lay utterly still on my lap. Gently, I placed my hands over the wound. I began concentrating on the deepest layers of flesh, where the tissue was most badly torn. At the same time, I inhaled deeply. I imagined that my lungs were filling not with air, but with light, the warm, soothing light of summer sun, here in the cherished lands of the deer people, where Halia and I had romped so freely, and would again, I felt certain. In time, the light overflowed into the rest of me, brimming in my shoulders, running down my arms, flowing through my fingertips. As the healing light poured into the ballymag's wound, his body, even his whiskers, began to relax. All at once he moaned again, but this moan was different, sounding less pained and more surprised, even perhaps pleased. But knowing how much delicate work lay ahead, I shot him a wrathful glare. Instantly he quieted. I began directing the light into the severed flesh. Like a bard restringing a broken harp, I turned from one strand of tissue to the next, binding and tightening with care, testing the strength of each before moving on. At one spot I found a tangle of ripped sinews cut almost to the bone. These I bathed in light for some time, just to separate them from each other. At length I loosened them, then gently reconnected the tissues, coaxing them back to strength, back to wholeness. Layer by layer I worked higher in the wound, slowly drawing nearer to the surface. Several minutes later I lifted my hands. The ballymag's black skin shone smooth and unbroken. Feeling drained, I leaned back against the stream bank, resting my head against a gorse root. Blue sky shone through the yellow blossoms above my head. At last I sat up. Lightly I tapped the ballymag's flank. "Well," I sighed, "you're in luck. I've decided not to boil you after all." The creature's eyes, already wide, swelled some more, but he said nothing. "It's true, poor fella. I never was going to harm you, but that was the only way I could get you to stay still."
"You're just toy annoying with me," he groaned, squirming in my lap. "Laughlessly play fooling me."
Halia looked at me warmly. "He doesn't believe you now, but he will in time."
"No chance happen of that."
The ballymag suddenly uncoiled several of his tails, wrapped them around a rock protruding from the bank, and wrenched himself free from my grip. He landed with a splash in the shallows at my feet. Spinning his 6 arms, he swam downstream at terrific speed. In a flash, he had rounded the bend and disappeared. Halia stroked her slender chin. "It's safe to say you healed him, young hawk." I glanced over at my shadow, crouching beside me on the mud, whose pose seemed hopelessly insolent. Glad I can get something right. She ducked under a branch and moved to my side as gracefully as an unfurling flower. "Healing, I think, is different from other magic." "How so?" Pensively, she rolled a twig between her fingers, then tossed it into the flowing water. "I'm not sure exactly, but more of healing magic seems to come from within, from your heart, perhaps, or someplace even deeper." "And other kinds of magic?" "From, well, outside of ourselves." She waved at the azure sky. "From out there somewhere. Those powers reach us, and sometimes flow through us, but don't really belong to us. Using them is more like using a tool, like a hammer or a saw." I pulled a mud-encrusted stick out of my hair, I understand, but what about the magic we use to change ourselves into deer? Doesn't that come from within?
No, not really.
Pondering her hand, she squeezed it into the shape of a hoof.
At the beginning, when I will myself to change, I can feel my inner magic, but only as a spark, a sort of invitation that connects me with the greater magic out there. That's the magic that brings change in all its forms, night into day, fawn into doe, seed into flower. The magic that promises.
She paused to stroke a curling shaft of fern sprouting beside her on the bank.
That every meadow buried in snow all winter long will spring into life once again.
I nodded, listening to the splatter and spray of the stream. A snake, thin and green, emerged from a tangle of reeds by my feet and slipped into the water. Sometimes I feel those outer powers, cosmic powers, so strongly they seem to be using me, wielding me like their own little tool, or writing me like a story whose ending I can't do anything to change.
Halia leaned closer, rubbing her shoulder against mine. It's all this talk, isn't it? Oh, yes, young hawk, I've heard it, even from some of my clan who ought to know better. All about your future, your destiny to be a wizard.
And not just any wizard, I added, but the greatest one of all times, even greater than my grandfather, Tuatha, they say, and he was the wisest and most powerful mage ever to live. It's, well, a lot of weight to carry around. So much that sometimes it's all I can feel, as if my own choices, my own decisions aren't really mine after all.
Oh, but they are. They surely are. That's what makes you, you. That's why I wanted to tell you. Her voice fell to a bare whisper. What I wanted to tell you.
So, will you tell me now?
No,
she declared, determined to stay on the subject.
Listen now, do you honestly think you have no more say in your future than the acorn that's destined to become an oak tree, that couldn't possibly become an ash or a maple, no matter how hard it tries?
Glumly, I scraped the muddy bank with the heel of my boot. So it seems.
But you have your own magic too. What I said about the outer powers is true, but they couldn't be used by us at all if we didn't have our own powers, our own magic within. And you, young hawk, have an amazing ability to tap into the greater magic, to receive it, concentrate it, and bend it to your will. I see it in you all the time, as clear as a face in a reflecting pool.
Maybe the reflection you see is yours, not mine. She shook her head so vigorously that her auburn braid flew over her shoulder, brushing against my ear.
Without your inner magic, you couldn't have healed the Ballymag the way you did.
But was I really using my own magic and my own choices to heal him? Or was I merely following my destiny, plodding through a scene in a story written by someone else long ago? My fingers drummed against the silver hilt of the weapon at my side. Even this sword is part of my destiny. That's what I was told by the great spirit Dagda himself. He commanded me to keep it safe, for someday I will deliver it to a great, though tragic king. A king so powerful that he will pull it free from a scabbard of stone. I paused, trying to remember how Dagda had described him. A king whose reign shall thrive in the heart long after it has withered on the land. Halia raised a sceptical eyebrow.
A destiny foretold be not a destiny lived.
Is that one of your people's old proverbs?
Not so old. It was my father who first said it. He thought a lot about such things.
She nudged me hard enough that my shoulder bumped a branch, knocking loose some leaves.
Like someone else.
I grinned, glancing at my staff leaning against a rounded stone at the stream's edge. Water slapped the shaft, moistening the 7 symbols engraved along its length, making them gleam darkly. The more I think about things, destiny or anything else, the less I really know. Suddenly Halia laughed.
My father said the same thing, more times than I could count.
I gave her a nudge of my own. What else did he have to say?
About destiny? She thought for a moment. Not much, though he did say something puzzling.
Which was?
He said, if I remember rightly, that seeking your destiny is like looking into a mirror. You see an image, however blurred, in whatever light exists at the time. But if the light ever changes, so will the image itself. And if the light ever vanishes, the mirror will be empty. That is why he concluded the truest mirror is... How did he put it? Oh, yes, the truest mirror is the one that needs no light at all.
Bewildered, I furrowed my brow. No light at all? What did he mean by that?
No one in my clan has ever made sense of it, though many have tried. Some of the elders, I'm told, have debated it endlessly, with no result. So it's best not to spend too much time pondering. It could have been merely a jest or a play on words. My father knew much, but he also loved to play tricks on people.
I nodded, still wondering about the curious pronouncement. It could well have been a jest, but what if it really held some meaning after all? Evidently the elders believed it did, or they wouldn't have wasted so much time trying to understand it. Perhaps someone, someday, would succeed. Perhaps even me. For a moment I savoured that thought, a lovely one indeed. I, Merlin, might be the one to shed light on the old mystery, and on many other mysteries as well. A sudden movement on the muddy bank distracted me. My shadow. Although I was sitting perfectly still, it seemed to be moving, indeed shaking. Could it be just the play of light from the stream? I concentrated my gaze. No, there could be no doubt. My shadow was shaking its head at me. Chapter 3. Secrets. I growled at my insolent shadow, still mocking me on the stream bank. Why didn't you just stay back there at the boulder? Hollia stiffened, slapping her hand on the muddy slope. Young hawk! Not you! Oh, I'm sorry. I reached out my hand, but she swatted it away. I glared down at my shadow, which seemed to be quivering with laughter. Hollia, I wasn't talking to you at all, just my shadow. Slowly, her expression softened. Seems you're having as much trouble with that shadow these days as you are with Gwynia. She pushed aside some branches to glance at the meadow where we had left her. She's gone again. I wonder where. Probably just foraging down the stream. She's not far away, that much is certain. I tossed a river stone onto my shadow, half expecting it to toss something back. So tell me, how did your father come to know so much? Was he a scholar? A bard? Neither. He was the healer of our clan for many years. Taking her braid, she toyed with it, separating the strands as if she were untying a much-knotted memory. Even after we were forced to leave our ancestral lands by the sea, which nearly broke his heart, he continued his work, and he knew much more than the art of healing. He understood things no one else did about certain places, and certain people. She swallowed. That was why, I suppose, he was entrusted with caring for one of the 7 wise tools. I started. Really? She nodded. Which one? I shouldn't say more. It's a secret among the Melwyn Braymeath. As I watched the water moving past our feet, my own memories flowed like the stream. I remembered well those legendary tools, having rescued most of them from the collapsing shrouded castle. There was the plough that tilled its own field, the saw that cut only as much wood as one needed, and what else? Oh yes, the magical hoe, hammer, and shovel, plus that bucket, feeling almost as heavy as the plough since it always brimmed with water. Only the 7th one had eluded me, though not my thoughts. For while I didn't know its description, let alone its powers, I had often dreamed of finding it, usually behind an impenetrable wall of flames. Whenever in my dreams I had tried to rescue it, the searing flames burned my hands, my face, my useless eyes. All I could hear were my screams. All I could smell was the stench of my own burning skin. When I couldn't stand the agony any longer, I always awoke, soaked in sweat. Gently, Halia touched my hand. "I can see from your face, young hawk, that you know some secrets of your own about the 7 wise tools." "That I do," I replied, still gazing at the stream. "I have held them all, even used them all, except for the one that was lost forever." She gazed at me, weighing her thoughts. At last she whispered, "It wasn't." "What do you mean? That's what everyone said, even Care-Pray." "Because that's what everyone thought, except for my father, and the few of us he had trusted with the secret. You see, that wise tool was the one in his charge, and when the wicked King Stangmar's soldiers came to seize it, my father gave them not the tool itself, but a copy he had made, a fake. The real one he hid away, somewhere safe." "Where?" "He never told anyone. Soon after he made the switch, the hunters found him." Reading the grief in her eyes, I wrapped my hand around hers. For some time we sat there, watching the swirling current. As much as I wanted to share her secret, I wanted still more to share her burden. At length she spoke again. "It was a key, young hawk, a magical key, carved of polished antler, with a single sapphire on its crown. Its powers, I can't remember. Like so much else my father told me. I was so young then. It mattered a great deal to him, that's mainly what I remember." Her fingers entwined with my own. "Though I do recall his saying once that, as great as its powers were, they still couldn't rival a healing hand." At that instant we heard a wailing cry from somewhere downstream. The cry grew swiftly louder and more familiar. A few seconds later, the ballymag came swimming straight toward us, his 6 arms splashing furiously. He swam up the channel, flopped onto the bank, and leaped into my arms, shivering and panting. Eyes ablaze with fear, he blurted, "Troublous terror, mangledest murder, it's get coming closer, Gulp." Before I could ask what he was talking about, an enormous head lifted out of a grove of hawthorns downstream. Gwynia! Her stiff ear snapped a few branches, sending up a cloud of leaves as she straightened her long, scaly neck. She stepped from the trees, wings folded tight against her massive back, and leaned toward us. The orange light of her eyes flashed on the water. "The fright dragon!" squealed the ballymag, burrowing his head under my arm. "We're doom killed, every dead lastest one of us." "Nonsense," I replied. "That dragon is our friend." "She won't harm you," added Halia. Hearing her friend's voice, Gwynia thumped her tail vigorously on the ground. One of her strokes, however, struck a hawthorn, uprooting it. The tree toppled with a crash into the stream, spraying mud and branches across the bank. At that, the ballymag shrieked and fainted. He lay in my lap as limp as a drenched tunic. Even his tails, once so tightly coiled, hung loose against his back. Gwynnia's head, now nearly above us, cocked to one side in puzzlement. I stroked the ballymag's smooth skin. This little fellow just isn't cut out for adventures. I think I ought to send him back to where he came from. "The haunted marsh?" asked Halia. "That's the last place you should send him." "It's where he came from." "Then he was wise to escape. That's an evil place, a dreadful place, with death traps at every turn. My people, like every other people except for the marsh ghouls, avoid it however we can." "Look, he clearly needs to be near water, and away from dragons. How he came to be here I can't say, but surely the best thing to do is to send him back to his home." Halia, shaking her head, touched the ballymag's wet back. "It's foolish, I tell you. And besides, that wretched swamp is all the way on the other side of the island." Hearing the doubt in her voice, I stiffened. "You don't think I can do it?" "Well, no, I don't. I frowned at her, my cheeks burning.
Leaping is one of the most hazardous skills of wizardry. You've told me so yourself.
My fist slammed the bank, spraying mud on my tunic. So, you think I can't?
What if you send him to the wrong place by mistake?
I won't make any mistakes. Noticing my shadow, which seemed to be shaking its head again, I bit my lip. And if by chance I do, then at least he'll wake up someplace where there's no dragon staring down at him. Carefully, I lay the unconscious ballymag down in the reeds at the water's edge. Then, grasping my staff, I stood. I planted my feet firmly, turned my back to Halia, and began to concentrate. Almost instantly, I felt the powers building within me, pushing to the surface like lava in an erupting volcano. Finally, I intoned the intricate chant, calling forth the high magic of leaping. Voyage near, venture far, lo, the leaping place and time. Find the centre of a star in the dreaming Mirthemnar, or the echo of a rhyme ringing rightly as a chime. Ever honour, never mar, lo, the leaping place and time. A flash of white light erupted on the bank. Water coursing through the channel sizzled into steam. At the same time, the ballymag vanished, along with Halia and myself. Chapter 4. Pain or Death. Pine needles! I rolled over and spat them from my mouth. Above, thick branches arched upward, looking sturdy enough to support the sky itself, and burly enough to obscure it. Only a few specks of light shone through the tight weave of limbs.
Good work, young hawk.
I cringed, spat out a chunk of sticky resin, then turned my head toward Halia. Like me, she lay on her back among the needles and broken sticks. All right, I admitted. So my leaping was a little off. She sat up, watching me solemnly.
A little, you say? Seems to me you were trying to send the ballymag, not us. Now we're here, in some forest, while he's nowhere in sight. And wasn't the haunted marsh your goal? I should be grateful, I suppose, your aim was so poor.
She shook a needle off her nose.
Compared to your aim in leaping, well, Gwynnia's aim in landing is superb.
Her expression darkened.
Where is she, anyway?
She bounced to her feet, spraying me with sticks.
Gwynia!
She called, her voice flying into the forest like a sparrowhawk.
My Gwynia!
No answer came. Halia turned to me, her brow knitted with concern.
Oh, I do hope she's all right. She'd answer me if she could hear. You don't think we—
Left her behind? I finished, pushing myself to my feet. I brushed the bark and needles off my tunic. It's possible, I'm afraid, very possible. I wasn't, after all, supposed to send her anywhere.
You weren't supposed to send us, either. Oh, she'll be horribly upset.
She glanced around the grove.
Maybe she's here somewhere, just out of earshot.
Wherever here is, I muttered. Tilting my head back, I peered up into the vaulting branches and drew a deep breath of air, poignant with the sweetness of cedar and pine. And something else, I realized. A slight odor of something rancid or rotting that lurked just beneath the sweetness. Nonetheless, I drank in the aromas, for as much as I disliked being lost, I always savored being in a forest. The darker, the better. For the darker the grove, the older the trees, and the older the trees, the more mysterious and more wise I knew them to be. A breeze rustled the needled branches, sprinkling my face with dew. Suddenly I thought of another day, in another forest, in the land of Gwynedd, called Wales by some. Pursued by a foe, I had escaped by climbing a tree, a great pine, much like the ones towering above us now. Moments later, I had found myself caught in a rising storm. The wind swelled, and I clung with all my strength to the tree. When the storm finally arrived in force, I rode out all the swaying and twirling, rocking and twisting, supported, nay, embraced by those branches. And when, at last, the storm subsided, leaving me drenched in the boughs of that rain-washed tree, I had felt refreshed, revived, and newly born. Halia tapped my arm. Just as I turned to her, another, stronger breeze coursed through the limbs above us. She started to speak, but I raised my hand to stop her. For in the creaking branches of the trees, I heard voices, deep and resonant. Yet these voices did not seem to belong to a forest whose boughs lifted so majestically. They sounded full of despair, and of pain slowly deepening. With all my concentration, I listened. The trees cried out to me, their great arms flailing. I could not understand all they said, for they were all speaking at once, sometimes in languages I hadn't yet mastered. Yet there were several whose words I could not mistake. From a stately cedar, "We are dying, dying." From a linden tree whose heart-shaped leaves twirled slowly to the ground, "It is eating me, swallowing my roots, my very roots." And from a powerful pine in mournful tones, "My child, do not take away my child." As the wind and the voices subsided, I turned to Halia. "This forest is in trouble somehow. Great trouble." "I feel it too. It doesn't seem natural." "No, it doesn't. Yet if you look closely, the signs are everywhere, like those death-grip vines on that stand of hemlocks. And here, look at this." Reaching for the trunk of a nearby pine, I scraped a bit of grey, scraggly moss off its bark. "Rotting beard. I've seen it on trees before, but only after a flood, never in a thriving forest." She nodded grimly. "I wish we could do something to help. But what? Besides, we have our own troubles. How can we find our way back to the summer lands? And to Gwynia, poor thing? And what about the Ballymag? Who can tell where he might be now?" Grinding my teeth, I stooped to retrieve my staff. "Look, I'm sorry. I had no idea that my leaping would go all awry like this." Squeezing the gnarled top of the staff, I lamented. I forgot the very first lesson, what Dagda himself called the soul of wizardry: humility. Angrily, I slid the staff under my belt. I need another 100 years of practice before trying something like that again. Why, I might have sent us to another land, or even another world. Halia shook her head. No. My feet, my nose, my bones all tell me we're still somewhere in Finkyra." She scanned the shadowed trunks surrounding us. "This forest reminds me a lot of an ancient grove that I visited years ago, when I was still a fawn child. The mixture of trees, the way they stand, it all feels so familiar. But that place was so much more alive. What kind of sickness could have attacked a whole forest like this?" groaned an anguished voice from behind the knotted roots of a cedar. "Terrible is pain of death." We rushed to the spot. The Ballymag, his round eyes more woeful than ever, stirred within the roots. Shards of bark and clumps of needles dangled from his claws. His padded belly quaked with the slightest movement, and his whiskers drooped morosely. Yet my second sight, keener than an owl's vision in the darkened grove, found no new signs of injury. Bending toward him, I tried to pull a twig, sticky with sap, out of one of his tails. He shrank away from me, cowering. "You've no reason to fear now," I coaxed. "The dragon isn't here." "But man-monster is." He lifted his nose and sniffed, as his eyes grew wider still. "And worse much, verilously worse much. This is terror place I least cringe won't be." He fell into a fit of shudders and groans. "Terror place." Halia caught her breath. "So you know where we are?"
Certainly, wailed the ballymag. Can't you smell a scent, flavorous puddle-muck?
No, I can't, I declared, whatever muckle scent means.
Puddle-muck,
the ballymag shut his eyes, muttering.
Man-monsters, so verilously, dumbly thick.
I shook him until his eyes reopened. Where do you think we are, then? Balefully, he looked up at us.
The darkenedest wood, edge south of haunted marsh.
I started. The marsh? Are you sure?
Certainly.
His whiskers bristled.
Think you I not smell no my own puddle-muck?
Halia shook her head.
That can't be right. The forest I remember was in the hills a long way south of the marshlands, practically a full day's run.
Are you sure? I asked.
Positive. I never forget a forest, certainly not an ancient one like this. And it wasn't even close to the haunted marsh.
Oh, whoa, but it verilously is,
squealed the ballymag, his whole body shaking. Waves of jiggly fat rolled down his belly.
Man-monster, please, hurt-pinch me, paw me, if you choose must. Tear, pull out these whisker-hairs, one shriek by one shriek, but get me here away.
Scowling, I studied the quivering creature. You're not making sense. Even if we were near the swamp, why don't you want to go back? I thought it was your home.
Was, absolutely, but not now longer. Not safe home.
My eyebrows lifted. Why not? He twisted, trying to push his head under one of the roots.
Can't talk explain, too horrible is.
Staring down at him, I wondered what could possibly be more horrible than the haunted marsh I well remembered. The putrid air, the gripping muck, and, worst of all, the marsh ghouls. I had seen their eerie, flickering eyes, and much more than that. I never wanted to feel their rage, their madness again. Halia, I knew, had been right. That swamp was the least known and most feared place on Finkyra, and for good reason. The ballymag, raising his head again, sighed through his shivers.
Oh, how I ache miss that home place, with its glorifice under wonders. Such a sweetly gush home place for such time long.
I traded disbelieving glances with Halia.
Ah, those putridous pools, he continued, his eyes glistening. Those bafflingest bogs, all so moosh-lovely and wet secret.
He cringed.
Until
what?
Ick stick,
cried the ballymag suddenly, pointing all his claws at my feet.
A danger scream!
I glanced down at the thick, crooked stick beside my boot, then back at him. No more hysterics now. I've had enough. I'm not running from sticks, nor should you.
But you don't.
Enough, I commanded, drawing my sword. A shaft of light, slicing through the branches overhead, caught the blade. It flashed brightly. This will save us from deadly sticks, or wailing ballymags. Halia frowned.
Come, let's find our way back to—
Ah! Both hands flew to her neck, tearing at the writhing, sinuous snake that had wrapped itself around her throat. Her face lost its colour. Her eyes bulged with terror. Raising my sword, I leaped to her aid.
Pain or death!
Shrieked the ballymag. All of a sudden, something heavy struck my lower back. It slid with incredible speed up my spine to my shoulders. Before I could even cry out, powerful muscles clamped round my neck. Another snake! My breath cut short. I barely caught sight of Halia collapsing to her knees, wrestling with her own strangling snake, when things started spinning. I tripped on something, kept myself from falling, but dropped my sword. Clumsily, I stumbled toward Halia. I had to reach her. Had to.
My fingers dug deep into the cold flesh around my neck. It felt hard, like a collar of stone. Even as I tugged, the snake squeezed relentlessly, drawing itself tighter and tighter. My head seemed about to explode, my arms and legs weaker by the second. Bolts of pain shot through my neck, head, and chest. I couldn't stand, couldn't breathe. Air! I needed air! Stumbling, I crashed to the ground, rolling on the needles. I struggled to stand, but I fell again, face down, still pulling at the serpent. Meanwhile, a strange darkness crept over me, and through me. I felt no more spinning, no more motion. Magic! I must use my magic, yet I lacked the strength. Something sharp jabbed my shoulder. I felt the cut, saw the blood. My sword, had I rolled on it? Vaguely, an idea glimmered in my mind. Using all my remaining strength, I tried to wriggle higher on the blade. Weakly, I twisted. The world grew darker. I felt the blade slicing my flesh, and possibly something else. Too weak to fight any longer, I ceased moving. A final wish flashed through my thoughts. Forgive me, Halia. Please. Suddenly, the snake's hold loosened. I drew a ragged, halting breath. My arms started tingling. My vision began clearing. Wrathfully, I tore the severed body of the snake from my neck. Halia, I could see, lay so near and so still. Grasping the hilt of the sword, I crawled to her side. The snake that had attacked her uncoiled slightly, raising its head from under her chin. It hissed angrily, yellow eyes sizzling. It shot toward me, just as I swung the sword. With a slap, the blade connected. The snake's head sailed into the air, thudding into the trunk of a tree. It fell to the forest floor. I dropped the sword and pulled myself to her side. Please, Halia, breathe again. I held her bruised neck, almost as purple as her robe, and shook her head. But she didn't stir. I stroked her cheeks. I squeezed her chilled hand. Nothing. Nothing at all. Halia! I cried, tears dampening my cheeks. Come back now. Come back. She made no movement. She showed no life, not even the faintest breath. Crumpling in despair, I fell upon her, my face pressed against her own. Don't die, I whispered. Not here. Not now. Something brushed against my cheek. Another tear? No, an eyelid. I lifted my face, looking into her own, even as she drew a struggling breath. And another. And another. In a moment she sat up. She coughed, rubbing her sore neck. Her eyes, so wide and brown and deep, caressed me for several seconds. Then they moved to the blood-stained sword by my side and the headless snake lying among the pine needles. Her lips quivered in a fleeting smile. Maybe, she said hoarsely, your aim isn't so bad, after all. Chapter 5. Flames Now Arise. It took a full hour for us to regain our strength, and for Halia to clean the slice on my shoulder so that I could will the tissues to heal, and it took nearly another hour for the ballymag to speak again, having been frightened completely out of his voice. Finally, we sat among the needles and gnarled roots, grateful to be alive, and entirely alert for any more snakes.
You bravely save, rasped the ballymag, leaning against a bulging root. He clawed anxiously at his whiskers. Muchly more bravely save than me.
I tossed a pine cone into the boughs of a sapling. At least you spotted that one before it attacked. How did you know it wasn't really a stick?
The angry eyes, almost asleep closed, but peeking still, yellow bright. Many terror times I find and hide them same before.
In the marsh? I leaned closer, peering at his round face. Those snakes came from there?
Very latterly.
I scowled. The place you called your wonderful home place. Halia rubbed her neck gingerly. Your word, I think, was moosh lovely?
Well...
The ballymag made an effort to clear his throat, while his row of tails twitched nervously.
I might could exaggerate a bit little.
A bit little? Puzzled, I shook my head. What's happening with the marsh? Even if it's not so far from here, as you believe, why did those snakes leave it? His round eyes closed tightly, then popped open.
Probably for dreadful same reason as I self.
Which is?
Too terrible is to tell, even whispers say.
The ballymag shook his head, along with his 6 arms and most of his tails.
Whatever my worst shriek dream fills, this be worsefullest, bigger much worsefullest.
Tell us. He shrunk down into the roots.
No, whoa.
Lightly, Halia touched my arm. He still doesn't trust you. I growled with exasperation. How many times do I have to save his life before he does? Well, no matter. He won't be with us much longer anyway. The ballymag gasped. His claws started to clatter with his shaking.
Man-monster plan going to chop or chew me?
Tempting, but no. I clambered to my feet and studied him ruefully. We're going to find our way, somehow, back to the Summerlands. But since I brought you here, it's my responsibility to get you safely to water somewhere. No, don't worry, not your moosh-lovely marsh, but we're bound to pass some watery place before long, and that's where I'll be leaving you, whether you like it or not. I don't care if it's a stream, a tarn, or a puddle. The ballymag's eyes narrowed, and he snapped a claw at me. With a sigh, I tore off a strip from the bottom of my tunic, tied the ends together, and draped it around my neck like a saggy sling. Then, despite his constant wriggling, I gathered him in my arms and placed him inside. Though one of his tails protruded, coiling and uncoiling in time to his nervous moans, the rest of him disappeared in the folds of cloth. Lightly, Halia touched the moaning bundle on my chest, causing the ballymag to shriek and curl himself into a huddled ball. She studied the bulging sling. He may not appreciate that you saved our lives, young hawk, but I do. I tapped the hilt of my sword. This is what really saved us. She stamped her foot on the ground like an angry doe. Come now, you sound as if you had nothing to do with it. I gazed at the shadowed trees. That's not what I mean. But we came close, too close, to dying right there. If I really have all the powers that Care Prey and the others think I have, expect me to have, then I shouldn't have been fooled by those snakes to begin with. Why can't you make mistakes sometimes like anyone else? Because I'm supposed to be a wizard. She placed her hands on her hips. All right then, great wizard. Why don't you tell me something, such as how we are going to get back to Gwynia before she frets herself to death, or tears up the countryside looking for me? Well, unless you'd like me to try leaping. No! Then we'll have to walk. I patted the sling and jerked away my hand just as a claw nearly snapped it, with our friendly companion here. Turning to the aged cedar by my side, I laid my hand upon its deep-rutted trunk. A waft of sweet resins came to me. I could almost feel them flowing beneath the bark. I wish I could find some way to help you, old one, and the rest of this place as well, but there just isn't time. The branches above me stirred slightly, sending down a shower of dead needles. I glanced at Halia, who had already strode off into the forest, following the slanting beams of the afternoon sun. I pressed my palm into the tree's bark for another few seconds and whispered, "Someday, perhaps, I'll return." Catching up with Halia wasn't easy. since she was trotting speedily through the woods. No doubt she would have suggested that we change ourselves into deer, but for her awareness that I needed to transport the ballymag. Yet even with 2 legs, she leaped with ease over roots and fallen trunks, while I seemed to snag my tunic on every passing branch. The ballymag's heavy sling didn't help, nor did the occasional claw that would reach out and snap at me. Panting, I finally caught up with her. "Do you," I huffed, "know where you're leading us?" She ducked beneath a fragrant bough of hemlock. "If this is the forest I remember, the summer lands lie to the west. I'm hoping to find a landmark I recognize before long." "And I'm hoping to find some water, to rid myself of this—" I slapped away the roving claw. "This baggage." For a long while we trekked through the trees, hearing only the crunching of our footsteps or the occasional scurrying of a squirrel on a branch. Then, from a ravine below us, we heard a sharp thud repeated several times, a sword or an axe hacking and chopping. Suddenly, a tormented wind swept through the branches, rising to a cacophonous moan. Both of us froze. I took Hollia's arm. "We can't do anything to save this forest, but maybe we can save at least one tree." She nodded. Following the chopping sound, we flew down the ravine, crashing through the thicket of blackberry bushes that covered the hillside. Though I tried my best to keep up with Hollia, she soon left me behind. Once I tripped on a fallen limb, landing with a thud on my chest, and on the ballymag, whose shrieks nearly deafened me. I regained my feet and again plunged down the hill. A few moments later, the ground leveled out. I burst into a narrow, grassy clearing. There stood Hollia, arms crossed against her chest, facing a man holding a rough-hewn axe. His ears, like those of most Finchirons, were slightly pointed at the top, but it was his eyes that commanded attention. They glowered angrily at the young woman who dared to stand between him and the tall, gnarled pine whose trunk bore a ragged gash in its side.
"Away with you, girl!"
His tattered tunic swirling about him, he waved his axe at Hollia. Behind him stood a woman, her expression as frayed as her uncombed hair. In her arms she held a baby who cried piteously while her thin legs thrashed the air.
"Away!"
shouted the exasperated man.
"It's only a wee bit of firewood we be wantin'."
He lifted his axe threateningly.
"And soon shall be gettin'."
"For that you don't need to cut down a whole tree," objected Hollia, not budging. "Certainly not an old one like this. Besides, there's plenty of wood on the ground. Here, I'll help you gather some."
"Not dry enough for kindlin'," retorted the man. "Now stand ye aside."
"I will not," declared Hollia. Panting from my run, I stepped to her side. "Nor will I." The man glared at us, eyes smouldering. He raised his axe higher. "Our babe, she needs warmth," wailed the woman. "And a morsel of cooked food. She hasn't eaten a scrap since yesterday morn." Hollia, her face softening, tilted her head in puzzlement. "Why not? Where is your home?" The woman hesitated, trading glances with her husband. "A village," she said cautiously. "Near the swamp." "The haunted marsh?" I asked, with a quick look at Hollia. "Isn't that a long way from here?" The woman eyed me strangely, but said nothing. "Wherever your village is," Hollia pressed, "why aren't you there now?" Ignoring the man's gesture to stay silent, the woman started to sob. "Because it be invaded by them." "By who?" The man swung his axe in the air.
"By the marsh ghouls," he answered gruffly. "Now move yourselves aside."
At that moment, the ballymag lifted his whiskered head above the edge of the sling. Then, at the sight of the axe, he whimpered loudly and promptly buried himself again in the folds. "Invaded?" I repeated. "I've never heard of marsh ghouls doing such a thing before." The woman tried to give her little girl a finger to suck, but the child pushed it away. Our village be bordering the swamp for 150 years, and we never heard of such a thing neither. There's screeches and wails, of course, we hear every night, louder than battling cats. But if we be leaving them alone, they do the same for us, until that all changed." Her husband took a step toward us, brandishing his axe.
"Enough talking,"
he barked. "Wait," I commanded. "If it's fire you want, I know another way." Before he could object, I raised my staff high. Beneath my fingertips, I could feel one of the engravings on the shaft, the carved shape of a butterfly. With my hand free, I pointed at a tangle of needles and sticks near the man's feet. Silently, I called upon the powers of changing, wherever they might be found. Though I felt no wind, my tunic suddenly billowed, sleeves flapping. Seeing this, the man gasped, while his wife drew back several steps. In a slow, rhythmic cadence, I spoke the ancient words of the Firebringer. "Flames now arise from forest or fen, brighter than eyes, beyond mortal ken. Father of heat, for anvil and pyre, mother of light, oh, infinite fire." A sizzling sound erupted from the wood. Brown needles curled downward, while bark split open and began to snap and pop. A thin trail of smoke rose upward, steadily swelling, until, flash, the sticks, bark, and needles burst into flames. The man shouted and leaped aside. Even so, the hem of his torn tunic caught a spark and started to burn. Hastily grabbing a tuft of long grass, he swatted at the flames. His wife, holding tight their child, backed farther away. At last, the fire on his tunic extinguished, the man turned to face me. For a long moment, he stared in silence.
"Sorcery,"
he growled at last.
"Cursed sorcery."
No, I replied. "Just a little magic, to help you." I waved at the crackling flames. "Come now, warm your family as well as your food by this fire." He looked at his wife, her eyes filled with a mixture of terror and longing. Then he took her by the arm.
"Never,"
he spat.
"No sorcerer's flames for us."
"But it's what you need." Heedless of my protests, they crossed the meadow and retreated into the trees. Halia and I stood there dumbfounded until the sounds of snapping sticks and the crying child no longer reached us. Glancing down at my shadow, I caught sight of it slapping its sides, jeering at me. I roared, jumping on top of it. Halia spun around, but the instant before she saw the shadow, it returned to normal, moving only as I did. She looked at me in bewilderment. Fuming, I stamped out the fire with my boot. My shadow, I was irked to see, did the same, but with a touch more vigor. With a sigh, I said, "I hadn't intended to frighten them, only to help them." She observed me sadly. "Intentions aren't everything, young hawk. Believe me, I know." For an instant she looked as if she yearned to say something more, but caught herself. She gestured in the direction of the departed family. "After all, they hadn't intended to kill this poor tree, only to build a fire for their child." "But they're one and the same." "Wasn't your trying to send the Ballymag home and sending us all here instead also one and the same?" My cheeks grew hotter. "That's completely different." I ground my heel into the coals. "At least this time the magic worked. Just not in the way I'd hoped." "Listen, you did what you could. I'm only lamenting... oh, I'm not even sure what." She watched the dying coals. "It's just hard sometimes to do the right thing." "So I shouldn't even try?" "No, just try carefully." Still perturbed, I gazed at her. Then, turning back to the scarred pine, I winced at the size of its wound. Maybe at least I can do one right thing today. Kneeling at the base of the elder pine, I reached out a finger and touched the sweet, sticky sap oozing out of the gouge. It felt thicker than blood, and lighter in hue, more amber than red. Even so, it seemed very much like the blood that had flowed from my own shoulder not long before. I listened to the barely audible whisper of its quivering needles. Then, very carefully, I placed both of my hands over the spot, willing the sap to hold itself back, to bind the wound. In time, I felt the sap congealing under my palms. Removing my hands, I crushed some fallen pine needles and spread them gently over the area. Bending closer, I blew several slow, steady breaths, all the while sending my thoughts into the fibers of the tree. Draw deep, you roots, and hold firm. Soar high, you branches, join with air and sun. Bark, grow thick and strong. And heartwood, stand sturdy, bend well. Finally, when I felt I could do no more, I backed away from the trunk. I turned to speak to Halia, but before I could, another voice spoke first. I had never heard it before, so breathy, vibrant, and strange, made more of air than of sound. Yet I knew it at once. It was the voice of the tree itself. Chapter 6. Bound Roots. To my surprise, the tree spoke not in the language of pines, that whooshing and whispering tongue I had come to know, but in the main language of Finkyra, the same language that Halia and I spoke to each other. Yet its airy voice and its cadence that swayed like a sapling were different, strikingly different. I had never heard anyone speak, or in truth sing, in such a way. In deepening soil my underroots toil, following, swallowing, arboresque moil. For year after year, for centuries dear, I build my roots to stand on, grow grand on, while branches reach skyward to make a crown royal. I build my roots to rise on, grow wise on, grow wise on. Uncertain, I backed away. After a moment, my shoulder bumped into Halia's. Her eyes, even wider than usual, were focused on the tree. From within the folds of my sling, another set of round eyes, along with some quivering whiskers, edged higher. Suddenly, the entire tree shuddered, with such evident pain that I felt myself shudder in response. Flakes of bark, wet with sap, drifted down from its branches, falling like tears on the meadow. Too soon comes the day, oh, spare me, I pray. Hacking, attacking, a man comes to slay. I stand in his path, incur his great wrath. Though never would I harm him, alarm him, my living, my learning would all end today, though never would I claim him, or maim him, or maim him. The breathy voice grew shrill, almost like a whistle. I felt a sharp pain in my ribs, as if a blade had plunged into my side. But the tree continued. Before life's sap ends, arrival of friends, braving, yes, saving, ere axe my heart rends. At this, Halia's hand slipped into my own. Whether from her touch or the tree's new tone, the pain in my side started to recede. Gradually, my back straightened, and I stood taller, even as the tree itself did the same. You challenge his will, defy him to kill. So I shall keep on living and giving. My limbs gladly lift, my trunk freely bends, so I shall keep on growing and knowing and knowing. Exultantly, the great pine tree waved its uppermost branches. Then, with a loud creaking, it twisted its trunk a full quarter turn, first to one side, then to the other. The tree, I realized, was stretching, preparing for some sort of strenuous feat. Midway up the trunk, a pair of grooves opened between strips of bark, revealing two slender, undulating eyes, as brown as the richest soil. The eyes gazed at us intently for several seconds, before finally turning downward. All of a sudden, the whole mass of roots began to quake, shaking the tree enough to shower us with needles, twigs, and bark. Wood creaked and snapped. Clods of earth, tossed loose by the roots, flew into the air. Halia's hand squeezed mine more tightly. The ballymag let out a frightened cry, then thrust his head deep inside the sling. At that moment, a very large root twisted, buckled, and broke free of the ground. With a spray of soil, the root slapped the turf like a knobby, hairy whip. Slowly, it splayed its hundreds of tendrils for balance. The trunk leaned to the side, placing much of its weight on the unburied root. On the opposite side, another root broke loose, then another, and another. Clumps of dirt sailed in all directions. Finally, the tree stood still again. Yet now it stood not beneath the ground, but on top of it. As Halia and I watched, peering into the soil-brown eyes, the tree lifted a broad root and took a step toward us. We did not flee. Rather, we stood like rooted saplings ourselves, drinking deeply of the moist, resinous air that swirled about us, wrapping us in a fragrant cloak. For we knew that we had encountered one of the best disguised creatures in all of Finkyra. A creature who could hide so well that decades, sometimes centuries, would pass without one of its kind ever being noticed. A creature whose name, in the old tongue, was Ninior Pennant. Always there, never found. A walking tree. With heavy, halting steps, the walking tree came closer. Behind it, a trail of moistened grasses sparkled in the sunlight. At last, when it was almost upon us, it stopped. Then, unhurriedly, the remotest tips of the tree's roots wrapped lightly around our ankles, pressing against our skin. Halia and I smiled, for we both felt the same surge of warmth flowing up our legs and into our bodies. In deep, breathy tones, the tree sang again. Our heartwoods are tied, we stand side by side, trusting, wind gusting, folly to hide. I know not your name, nor whither you came, yet now we are kin roots, lo, twin roots. For though I felt lost and silently cried, yet now we are found roots, lo, bound roots, lo, bound roots. The final phrase seemed to rise on a breeze, stirring the branches of a graceful cedar nearby. The drooping limbs lifted and fell, as smoothly as a single breath. Other trees caught the same lilt, rustling the air. Still others followed, until all around us branches swished and whispered, swaying in unison. In time, the whole grove, the whole forest, it seemed, joined in the song of celebration. Then, abruptly, the music shifted. Harsher and deeper tones emerged. The branches started clacking and moaning. As the dissonance swelled, it reminded me of the first cries of pain I had heard from the trees. But this time the wailing reverberated across the whole forest, as if the land itself were drowning in a wave of suffering. Against this background, the walking tree raised its voice. It sang to us in words heavy with sorrow. On land where we thrive, the blight does arrive, cleaving, bereaving, till none left alive. Advancing by stealth, it chops at our health. It poisons all our breedlings, our seedlings. Their leaves cannot breathe, their roots not survive. It poisons all our taplings, our saplings, our saplings. I felt drawn as never before to the spirit of this tree, and to those many saplings yearning to live, whose anguish it bore. "What is this blight?" I cried out. "Can't it be stopped?" All of a sudden the tree went rigid. Throughout the forest the moaning branches fell silent, even as a new sound, a relentless pounding, rose in the distance. Louder and louder it swelled, as rhythmic as a great drum, shaking the ground and the trees anchored within it. Whether the sound came from somewhere in the forest or from somewhere beyond, it was clearly approaching, rapidly. The walking tree stirred again. Its roots uncoiled from our legs, curled sharply downward, and plunged into the ground. As they worked themselves into the soil, the roots vibrated, humming in mournful tones that echoed the final phrase of the tree's song. Our saplings. Our saplings. An instant later, the tree's slender eyes closed behind lids of bark. As they disappeared, so did any sign that this was anything but another pine, one more tree among many. Meanwhile, the clamorous rumbling grew louder. Twigs and flakes of bark, knocked loose from the vibrations, rained down on us. I felt the ballymag curl into a tight ball inside the sling, his row of tails twitching anxiously against my chest. A high branch split off and crashed down through the layers of limbs, thudding into the roots by our feet. Halia pulled my arm frantically. "We must run, young hawk, away from here." "Wait," I objected. "I know that sound. We should—" But she had already dashed from my side. I saw her legs blurring with motion, her back pitching forward, her neck thrusting higher. Her purple robe shifted to green, then glistening tan. Muscles rippled across her back and legs, while her feet and hands melted into hooves. Halia, now a deer, bounded into the trees. I watched her vanish. Then I, too, started to run, not away from the rumbling, but toward it. Chapter 7. A Fiery Eye. I dashed through the dark woods, drawing ever nearer to the swelling rumble. Pounding, pounding like thunder of the land, it shook the towering trees down to their roots, making them shudder and groan. Every few steps I heard the crash of a falling limb or a toppled tree whose roots had wrenched loose at last. Cracks opened in the soil, roots popped and split, stalks of fern as delicate as dragonfly wings trembled in unison. With the help of my staff, I kept my balance, and despite the ballymag's shouts and every jostle and bounce, I kept my ears to the rumbling, for I wanted to find its source. The trees began to thin, allowing more light to reach the forest floor. I pushed past a net of vines studded with red flowers. All at once, I broke into full, unobstructed sunlight. I stood at the top of a long slope, surveying the vista. Auburn grass, swaying with shifting winds, fell away from me, almost to the horizon, finally merging in the far distance with a dark line of shifting, steaming vapors. It was I knew with a shudder, a vast swamp, the haunted marsh. So near! The Ballymag had been right after all. Yet Holly's memory of this forest and its distance from the marshlands couldn't have been more clear. Could the swamp be advancing, pushing its way into the forest? And so rapidly? Something told me that this forest blight, in all its forms, stemmed from the encroaching marsh, as did those strangling snakes, the ghouls that had driven the family from its village, and whatever forces had robbed the Ballymag of his home. But what lay behind it all? Was it possible that something else, even more sinister than the marsh itself, was at work here? At the bottom of the slope, near the swamp's edge, towered a grove of immense, ragged trees. Though a great distance away, they stood out sharply against the roving mists beyond. Almost as wide as they were tall, they stirred strangely, as if caught in a ceaseless, circling wind. Then, all at once, I realized that they were not trees at all, and that they were the source of the incessant pounding. For as overwhelming, no, as terrifying, as that sound was, I had heard it before, and never forgotten. I knew its thunderous impact, its relentless rhythm. Nothing could shake in that way the soil and the air and everything in between. Nothing but the footsteps of giants. Bracing myself, I watched the hulking figures march steadily up the slope. With remarkable speed they climbed, though they seemed as immense and heavy as the tallest trees. Yet with each passing second their outlines grew more clear. Powerful trunks transformed into legs, bellies, and chests. Hefty branches became arms covered with wild tangles of hair. Necks, jaws, and eyes also appeared, along with noses, some as sharp as pinnacles, others as round as boulders. A few giants wore little clothing but a ragged beard and shaggy pants woven of leafy branches and strips of turf. Others, however, wore colourful vests and bristling cloaks. Earrings made of millstones and water wheels poked through their long manes. Wide belts carried immense hatchets and daggers the size of grown men. For all the variety of their garb, however, they shared one common quality: sheer, stupendous size. As they drew nearer, the crushing blows of their footsteps grew louder. Leaning against my staff, I recalled standing by the feet of my friend Shim, stretching just to touch the top of one of his hairy toes. I glanced down at my own feet, so puny by comparison, and I remembered seeing my footprints glistening in the wet sand on the day my makeshift raft had somehow brought me to Finkyra's shore. That day seemed so long ago, and yet so close at hand. My gaze moved to my shadow. Like me, it quivered with every new wave of rumbling that shook the ground, only more so. It swayed and flailed wildly, like a distorted reflection in the waters of a wind-blown pond. As I tried my best to stay upright, the Ballymag poked half his head out of the sling. Seeing the approaching giants, he gasped in horror. One of his claws clamped on the neck of my tunic. He looked up at me, eyes ablaze with fear.
Verilously, he stammered, there shriek be tree-tall, thunder-stepping crush giants.
I nodded, watching them march up the hill.
Why, man-monster, not run, hide?
He tugged on my tunic.
Now, speed!
Because, I answered, raising my voice over the rumbling, I want to talk to them. The Ballymag's whiskers splayed in every direction, as stiff as dried grass.
Man-monster, you couldn't, wouldn't.
He turned toward the advancing line of giants. With a sharp squeal, he fainted away, sliding limply back into the sling. I scanned the giants' craggy faces, looming larger by the second. Their ancient race, Finkyra's first people, possessed deep understanding of the land and its mysteries. Immense as they were, I knew that their keen eyes often noticed details that many smaller creatures ignored. Sometimes their great height above the ground allowed them to sense patterns that others couldn't perceive. Perhaps, just perhaps, they could explain the sudden growth of the swamp and all the trouble it had caused. To be sure, something strange was happening in the haunted marsh, and though I didn't yet understand it, I felt a growing fear that it threatened more than the swamp's immediate neighbors. Pondering the dark, shifting vapors at the edge of the bog, I touched the chafed skin of my neck. Something down in that morass, I suspected, could choke off part of Finkyra's future, much as that snake had nearly choked me. And a wizard, at least a great wizard like Tuatha, would do everything in his power to prevent it. Whether or not the giants would tell me anything was another question. They were shy and generally unwilling to share their secrets. Even though, thanks to Shim, I had spent some time among them, I was still an outsider, and a man, and, worse yet, the son of the wicked king who had hunted them down mercilessly. As the ground rocked beneath me, and my heart galloped inside my chest, I fought to stay calm. Would any of them stop to hear me, or would they crush me before I could even ask my questions? Then, borne by some faraway wind of memory, I heard again the words of a friend whispered to me on my first visit to Varigel, the giant's ancient city of stone.
"One day, Merlin, you may find that the merest trembling of a butterfly's wings can be just as powerful as a quake that moves mountains."
But whether this was the day, I had no idea. Their gargantuan shadows fell over me. Anxiously, I reminded myself that giants were fundamentally peaceful, most of the time, at least. One Finkyran giant could flatten a tree with a single blow, drink a lake dry within minutes, or crush a boulder with ease. Once I had seen a brawny female lifting a chunk of rock that would have required at least 50 people my size to move. She had tossed it about like a bale of summer hay. Still, thankfully, they rarely used their strength to harm others. Or so I hoped. There were 6 of them, each taller than the tallest trees in the forest, and Shim, I could see, was not among them. Worse, their faces looked positively grim and wrathful. As they came closer, rocking the ground with every step, I realized that they were dragging something behind them, a huge bundle caked in mud, peat, and brambles. "You are either very brave or very foolish," declared a familiar voice. "Halia!" She was just emerging from the trees, her form metamorphosing back into a woman. Briskly, she stepped to my side on the open grass, her doe eyes darting from me to the immense forms striding up the slope. I waved her back. "Stay in the trees, where it's safer." "Not if you are here." My jaw clenched. "You were right to run away in the first place." "Until I realized that you weren't coming, and that the swamplands had grown so much, more than I could have ever dreamed." Defiantly, she thrust out her chin. "I'm staying with you, young hawk." "But I don't—" A booming voice from high above our heads cut me off.
"Behold, a manling and a womanling!"
It was one of the lead giants, a female, whose serpentine hair, the color of rust, reached down to her knees.
"They bring trouble!"
"No,"
countered another gruffly. He licked his wide lips.
They bring food. Not much, but more than that meager taste of swamp berries."
He reached toward us, his great hand grasping the air. Even as we started to back away, a third giant, whose dark beard was caked with the same mud that covered the bundle, roughly shoved his arm aside.
"Let him livin'," he barked. "Yous has seen enough dinin' for 1 days."
His companion closed his hand into a fist.
"Nobody else, mainly you, can tell me what to do." "That's 'cause you're so thickster you never's understandin' and nobody else'n."
He beamed as 2 others guffawed at his joke.
"It's truer."
Growling with rage, the ridiculed giant swung his fist. While missing his target, he clipped off several high limbs from a tree. Needles and broken branches showered us. Halia jumped and started to dash away, but caught herself.
"Seeing there? You can't even hitsin' what you wantsin'. Ha 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 ha!"
The other giant lunged at him, but his massive foot caught on the edge of the bundle, and he lost his balance. Bellowing angrily, he crashed on the grassy slope, so hard that both Halia and I tumbled over backward. We righted ourselves in time to see the two belligerents start wrestling. Their huge bodies rolled over each other, arms and legs thudding the ground. The other giants moved closer to watch, shouting jeers at the two wrestlers, leaving the mud-covered bundle unattended. And then the bundle groaned. An avalanche of mud fell from the lower end, revealing a pair of huge, hairy toes. Then came another groan and a sudden twist, spraying more putrid-smelling debris on the grass. A few paces from us, a fiery pink eye opened, blinking from all the muck weighing down its lid. Above the eye loomed a gargantuan, pear-shaped nose, its cavernous nostrils stuffed with stones, sticks, and ooze. At the base of the encrusted giant's head, the layers of slop started vibrating. The faster the chin, or neck, or whatever lay beneath, shook, the more clumps of swamp matter flew into the air. Halia barely dodged a decaying branch which struck the grass beside her, splintering into shards. Then a crack appeared in the mountain of muck. Slowly, it widened into a crevasse-like mouth. Moaned the buried giant.
"I is feeling sickly sick." "Certainly, definitely, absolutely."
"Shim!" I exclaimed, recognizing his favorite phrase, if not his voice due to all the muck blocking his nose. Rushing to his side, I shouted into his clogged ear, "It's me, Merlin!" The bulbous nose scrunched, breaking off an avalanche of debris. A good deal landed in Shim's mouth, causing him to spit and cough violently. That in turn dislodged more swamp muck, which he in turn swallowed, making him cough all the more. The fit lasted several minutes. To avoid being struck by his pounding head and flailing arms, I retreated to the very edge of the trees. Halia, back at my side, shot me an anxious glance. "You know this giant?" "My, yes! Since before he got, well, so big. He helped me save the wise tools when Stangmar's castle collapsed." "He could still crush you like a worm underfoot if you're not careful." I waved my staff at the other giants a short way down the slope. They were still so busy shouting at the two wrestlers and roughly shoving each other that they hadn't noticed Shim's revival. They worry me a lot more. Shim's a friend, and he might know what's really happening down there in the marsh. Seeing Shim's violent spasm coming to an end, I started back toward him, but Halia's gaze, as piercing as a spear, halted me. "Listen, young hawk, giants are bad enough, but at least you might outrun them. The haunted marsh, though, is something else again. What more do you need to know, other than it's already too near? Right down there, at the base of this hill. Let's get away as fast as we can." "Believe me, I understand. When I was there before, well, I don't want to go back unless it's absolutely necessary." Deep within the sling on my chest, I heard a muffled groan. Even while unconscious, the Ballymag was voicing his views. "How can you even speak about going back there?" Halia pressed. "Once should have been enough." "All I know is something feels very wrong." I motioned toward the dark vapors rising from the swampland. "There's a presence down there, something I haven't felt in a long time. I can't quite put my finger on it, but I know it's dangerous." She eyed me doubtfully. "Careful, young hawk. This is one time to be sure of your intentions." "I am sure. I want to help the land. Our land." "Not just to be someone's image of a great wizard?" "No." I jabbed my staff into the turf. "And whether or not you believe it, I also intend to be careful." She drew a slow, unsteady breath and shook her head. Chapter 8. Arrows that Pierce the Day. As Shim's thunderous cough faded into a rasp, I stepped nearer. "Tell me, old friend, what happened to you?" He made an effort to sit up, then fell back to the grass with a resounding thud. The noise was lost, however, in the ongoing tumult from the wrestling giants not far down the hill. Their bellows and roars, punctuated by bodies slamming the turf with enough force to shake the entire slope, joined with the shouts of their onlooking companions.
"My poorly nose," moaned Shim. "So stuffed and full of muckly muck. Can barely breathe."
His massive head turned toward me, spilling more mud and twisted, barkless remains of a tree.
"Merlin, what is you doing here?"
"A mistake, my own, but it's good to see you again."
"And you, even with so much disgustingly muck."
He groaned, lifted his hand, and took a swipe at his nose.
"I'd be gladly to take you homely, but I can hardly move. I feel so weakly, certainly, definitely, absolutely."
"What happened?" His pink eyes glowed like a smith's tongs.
"They tried to block the giant's roadway, the anciently way across the marsh. Why, it's been there since Finkara was born dead, and it's our bestly pathway for summer fishing in the eastern seas."
Glancing at the grappling giants, I shook my head. Who would be so foolish, so brazen?
"Marsh ghouls."
Marsh ghouls?
"Yes."
His enormous hand closed into a fist.
"When we tried to open the roadway anew, they attack us with arrows, murderly arrows, so strong they can pierce the day."
Behind me, Halia gasped. At the same time, I could feel the ballymag starting to stir again in the sling upon my chest. "What do you mean, Shim, arrows that pierce the day?"
"Angrily,"
he bellowed, ignoring my question.
"I get angrily. I chases them off the roadway. Those ghouls, they trick me. I fall head firstly into a deeply pool of muck."
I reached my hand to touch his earlobe, though it was so caked with mud that only a few patches of skin shone through. "That was brave of you."
"Brave, but stupidly."
"Maybe so," I grinned. "But I remember a day when you weren't so brave, when you'd run until sundown just to avoid a bee sting." Shim half guffawed, half coughed.
"I never did like getting stinged."
Then the edges of his mouth turned down.
"This time, though, I almost drowned. Only my friend's brawny arms pulls me freely, and even then, I thinks I'm surely going to die from muckly muck."
Solemnly, I pondered his words. My heart beat almost as loud, it seemed, as the shouting giants down the slope. But why, Shim? Why have the marsh ghouls suddenly turned so vicious? They were always frightening, to be sure, but only to those who entered their territory. Now they're attacking giants, terrorizing villagers, as if they're chasing everyone else, even the snakes, out of the swamp. The great eye studied me knowingly.
"I've seen that look before, Merlin. You is full of madness again."
and your nose is full of muck. Here, let me see if I can help you." Using my staff for support, I began to scale the slippery mountain that was the head of my friend. It took me some time just to climb over his tangled hair to the rim of his ear. Then, just as I mounted it, a new wave of mud slid over me, knocking me back to the ground. At the same time, a potent smell, heavy with fetid, rotting odors, filled the air, making my lungs burn. Without bothering to brush off my tunic, I started up his head again. By wedging my staff under a mud-crusted stone, I finally managed to reach the top of his ear. Pushing higher, I surmounted his temple and crawled over his cheek, trying hard not to slip in the layers of ooze, until at last I reached the base of his massive nose. There, I found myself facing a pair of cavernous nostrils, completely blocked with debris. Planting my boots firmly, I tried pulling out some of the muck and branches. Only a small amount came free. The nostrils were jammed tight. I tried poking at the blockage with my staff, without much success.
"Give up, Merlin," moaned Shim,
speaking softly so the force of his voice wouldn't knock me off his upper lip.
"It's all too stuckly."
"Not yet," I replied. "Maybe if I try something else, I can break through." I slid the staff under my belt and took the hilt of my sword. As I pulled it from its scabbard, the blade rang in the air, echoing like a faraway chime. As many times as I had heard that sound, it always reminded me of the sword's heralded destiny, and its connection, however mysterious, to my own. I turned the blade in my hand, flashing it in the sun. At one point, I caught the reflection of my own face, looking back at me with pride, and yes, even confidence. Carefully, I aimed the sword at one of Shim's clogged nostrils. "Hold still," I commanded. "Very still."
"You is full of madness," he muttered. "Just don't sting me with that pokingly blade."
I drew back the sword and plunged it in. Though I twisted it vigorously, no muck came free. I jerked it loose, raised the gleaming blade over my head, and jabbed again. This time, I wrenched my whole arm as I thrust. At that moment, one of the other giants, the rust-haired female, turned around.
"Hold!"
she shouted, waving her long arms.
"The manling is trying to kill Shim!"
All but the two wrestling giants immediately froze. They let loose a unified bellow of rage. At the same time, several giants charged up the slope, their faces contorted with wrath. Immense hands reached toward me, eager to crush every bone in my body. Whirling to face them, I pulled my sword free. Almost. Something in the jammed nostril caught the blade, holding it tight. I tugged and twisted, to no avail. I heard Halia scream. At the same time, the sky above me went completely dark. The smell of sweaty hands replaced the odor of the swamp. In just an instant, powerful fingers would close over me, squeezing the air from my lungs, the life from my body. Suddenly, an eruption, as violent as any volcano, threw me high into the air. My ears almost burst from the simultaneous roar. Arms and legs flailing, I tumbled helplessly, aware only of my own flight, and of the slimy, grey-green ooze that covered my face and chest. For Shim, I knew beyond any doubt, had sneezed. I struck the ground. After much rolling and bouncing, I finally came to a halt. Though my head was spinning, I lifted myself into a sitting position and wiped my cheeks and brow. Far up the slope, I could see the giants gathered around Shim, slapping and shaking him. I smiled and hoped that, in time, he would feel strong enough to walk again, and that, at long last, his nose was clear. A beautiful doe bounded over the grass toward me. Approaching a boulder, she leaped skyward, her muscular legs tucked beneath her body. As she sailed gracefully over the obstacle, she held perfectly still for a single magical heartbeat. When at last she landed, the ground seemed to move toward her, lifting itself to greet her hooves, and when she sprinted the last few lengths toward me, My own face felt the rushing of air, my own thighs the pounding of turf, for I remembered with aching clarity the freedom of running like a deer. Stretching my stiff shoulders, I thought about the legend first told to me by clip1 that long ago all Finkyran men and women could fly. Everyone possessed wings, he claimed, wings that had been treasured before they were somehow lost forever. Many times I had wished that I, too, could fly. Yet, as I followed Hollyer's movement down the slope, drawing near to me with every bound, I knew that I would rather fly over the ground in another way altogether, with her at my side. I watched as the doe slowed her gait to a walk. At the same time, she straightened up, lifted her head, and transformed into a young woman. She strode quickly to join me. Seeing me uninjured and covered with swamp muck, she broke into a grin. "You do have a way with giants, young hawk." "Only ones with clogged noses." I clambered to my feet. With difficulty, because of all the filth sticking to my boots, I managed to step clear of the debris. But apart from a few bruises and a scraped hip, I felt no injuries. My staff, still hanging from my belt, was also intact, as was the ballymag, whose muffled ranting and howling from inside the sling told me that he had revived, and that he remained quite unharmed. Hollyer's grin faded. "Please now, let us return to the summer lands, to my people, and also my dear Gwynia. She'll be frantic by now." Instead of replying, I turned my gaze toward the steaming bog that stretched all the way to the horizon. Reading my thoughts, she persisted. "Perhaps you'll find some way to help, but later, when you know more. The elders of my clan might be able to tell you some useful things about the marshlands. And there's clip1, too. Surely he can advise you." Still facing the marsh, I gave a subtle nod. He could, that's true. "Besides, young hawk, you just can't go in there. No one goes in there." Slowly, I turned back to her. Then why do I feel so drawn to it, even as I feel so repelled by it, and whatever dangers it holds? She sighed. "I don't know, but shouldn't you look for the answer to that before you go any further?" "I've been looking, believe me, but it's all a blur." I chewed on my lip. A real wizard, I think, would see things more clearly. Moving closer, she fingered the muddy sleeve of my tunic. "A real wizard would know what he can do, and what he cannot." "I suppose—" I hesitated, clenching my jaw. "I suppose it's folly to rush into this. That forest has survived for centuries. Surely it can last a little while longer. Long enough, at least, for me to learn more about what's really happening." "That's right," she said softly. "And now let's run, before the sun falls any lower." "You lead," I proposed. Then, noticing my empty scabbard, I caught my breath. "My sword! Where is it?" Hollier spun around. "There," she announced, pointing down the slope. "See where it landed?" Indeed, it could not be missed, for my shining sword stood perfectly upright, its tip planted in the soil, its hilt held high. Rather than a weapon, it looked more like a marker, dividing the forested lands above from the swampy morass below. In the distance, the swirling vapors almost seemed to reach toward it, curling themselves around the hilt, clutching at the blade. At that instant, a large grey-winged bird swooped out of the sky. Without slowing its plunge, it clasped the hilt in its claws and wrenched the sword free from the ground. The bird gave a raucous shriek, flapped its powerful wings with a slow rowing motion, and rose again into the sky. "Come back!" I shouted, so taken aback that I couldn't have wielded any magic even if I had known what magic to use. Flapping slowly, almost wearily, the great bird flew toward the lowering sun and the vast reaches of the haunted marsh. In what seemed like only a few seconds, and at the same time an eternity, it entered the twisting columns of vapors. Then, with another shriek, it released its prize. My sword flashed bright once again,
then plummeted downward, vanishing in the mist. Chapter 9. Lost. Aghast, I watched the dark vapors swallow my blade, and the bird who had stolen it. Gone, I said in disbelief. Gone! I must get it back. Wait! Halia's round eyes peered at the distant swamp, whose contorted clouds lined the horizon. The sun, riding low in the sky, painted the entire vista gold with a growing hint of scarlet. It's all so strange. Why would a bird do such a thing? Unless, perhaps, it was... She shook her head, as if hoping to banish an unwanted thought. What? I pressed. A way to lure you into the marsh. I raised an eyebrow. A trap? For you, young hawk. Not likely. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I still need my sword. There are other swords. You can let the marsh ghouls have that one. No, I can't. That sword is part of me. Part of my... destiny? She scowled at me. It's time you chose your own path, don't you think? Yes, I agreed, my voice firm. And now I am sure. This is my path. Wincing, she closed her eyes for a moment. So you're going down there? And wherever else I must. Halia, what if the sword is somehow tied up with the rest of this evil business? I have to do something, whatever I can. I studied her auburn hair, aglow in the light. You should go back to your people, and Gwynia, I'll rejoin you after the marsh. As I spoke the final phrase, I felt the ballymag shudder against my ribs. His claws started clacking anxiously within the sling. Taking Halia's hand, I added quietly, I'll still be with you, you know. In one way, at least. Her hand trembling in my own, she declared, No, that's not enough. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I'm coming with you. No, you shouldn't. But I will. Her eyes darted skyward. I only wish Gwynia were here to come too.
Not to me!
Shrieked the ballymag, thrusting his seal-like face out of the folds of cloth.
Think you I suffer fled, such terror woe, such crampy mess, just back go to Certina's danger scream?
He thrust a pair of hefty claws at me, snapping them under my nose.
You horriblest man-monster! You'll squeal bring my end to finish, and me, poor me, just a bear baby.
Sorry, I said, pushing away the claws. I didn't want to, didn't know.
Excuse, manure!
Tears gathered in the ballymag's eyes.
I shall be bravely strong, shall. I crawled my own away to Watersweet before, and hopelessly again will. If sad, I am not swallow-gulped by dragon beasts or man-monsters firsters.
Halia reached her hand toward him. Lightly she brushed one of his trembling whiskers. We didn't mean to bring you back here, just to help you. The ballymag tried to growl, though it sounded more like a whimper.
Help save some other body next time.
He drew a shaky breath.
Now I should suffer flee, but first, he added with a glance at my empty scabbard, heed no my warn say. Unless you luscious love pain or death, keep away from terriblest marsh place.
I gazed at the swirling vapors of the swamp. Can you tell us something, anything, about what's happening down there? Please, coaxed Halia. Anything at all. The ballymag, who was starting to climb out of the sling, shuddered.
The marsh ghouls. They've started kill-attacking. Body every, verilously body every.
He looked anxiously toward the boglands.
I know not reason why, but they're dreadfuls.
A clamorous roar from up the slope cut him off.
We turned to see one of the giants standing taller than the trees behind him at the top of the slope. The same one who had tried to eat me at the forest edge. Angrier than ever, he waved his massive fists in the air.
"There you are," he bellowed. I can taste your moldy little bones already."
One of the other giants, standing over Shim's prone form, shouted something to him, but he waved the words away.
"No miserable manling escapes from me, I say. I'll mangle him and all his friends."
With that, he started stomping toward us. The ballymag shrieked and plunged his head back into the sling. Halia grabbed my arm, jerking me down the slope. Together we ran, with loping strides as the ground rocked beneath us.
"Come back here, manling!"
With all our speed we fled, leaping over rocks and gorse bushes. The rumbling grew steadily louder, as did the giants' rasping breaths, while the turf shook ever more violently. Meanwhile, the slope started to flatten, as the long grasses gave way to bare soil. Soon our feet were squelching over patches of mud and slapping through puddles. As mist swirled around us, the scent of things rotting fouled the air. Even over the giants' thunderous steps, I could hear strange cries and howls, and a distant screech, almost a laugh, echoing over the marshes. Abruptly, Halia slowed her running. "His footsteps! They've stopped!" Realizing she was right, I too slowed. Together we came to a halt on a sagging mass of peat surrounded by a stretch of brownish-yellow bog grasses. Although the air reeked of decay, we stood panting, trying to catch our breath. I watched as thick vapors, tinted the color of rust by the setting sun, closed behind us, drawing together like a curtain that cut us off from the world that we knew. Those vapors offered us protection at this moment, and, I feared, imprisonment at another. I took Halia's arm. "Come, we've got to find some sort of shelter before nightfall."
"Oh, woe! Oh, woe!" moaned the ballymag from his hiding place by my chest. "Terriblest fate, horriblest end."
We plodded across the bog grasses, alert for any signs of snakes or other creatures still more dangerous. Before long, a continuous array of sounds, a loud bubbling from one side, a sharp whistling from another, rose all around us. We slogged onward through a flooded plain where thorny vines clutched at our legs. Halia, who had refused my offer to cover her bare feet with my boots, twisted her braid nervously as we walked. As the mist darkened, the gloom deepened. Crossing a murky pool, I stepped on something hard, which suddenly moved. I pitched forward, falling face first into the reeking slop. With help from Halia, I righted myself, only to slip and fall backward with a splash. As I struggled to stand again, something slithered into the sleeve of my tunic. "Yah!" I shouted, furiously slapping my sleeve. I rolled over in the pool, even as the creature, whatever it was, slid up my arm. Finally, I grasped it on my shoulder. With all my strength, I squeezed it through my tunic. Something popped, and the creature shrunk down like a collapsing bellows. I felt a sticky ooze dribble down my arm. When I shook the arm, a dark shape splattered into the pool. I turned away, having no desire to look any closer.
"Man-monster," grumbled the voice in my mud-splattered sling. "You be a veryless clumsy-foot."
"Ballymag," I replied, "you be a veryless whiny-mouth." Halia shook her head. "Quiet, you two." She pulled a clump of reeds out of my hair. "It's growing darker, and Oh, listen!" A thin, unsteady wailing rose in the distance. At the same time, a distinctly stronger smell, as putrid as rotting flesh, washed over us. The wailing voice went on, never pausing, pulsing with anguish. And with something else, something like despair. Even as Holia and I cringed, it was joined by other voices, bleating, crying, groaning. The voices swelled, rising into a hideous chorus. The Ballymag's head edged out of the sling.
It's the Marshagools, he sputtered.
The rolls of fat around his neck quivered.
They're come killing!
We stood, up to our knees in murky water, as the anguished dirge grew louder. At the same time, the last traces of daylight began to fade. Then, not far away, a single spot of light appeared, hovering eerily over the marsh. Faintly it pulsed, wavering like a wounded eye. Then another light appeared, and another, and another. Slowly, slowly, they started approaching, advancing on us.
"Oh, woe! Oh, woe!" moaned the Ballymag. "Quickly now! Follow fastestly!"
He jumped out of the sling and splashed into the bog. Instantly he swam off, with his broad tail flapping and all his arms whirling. Holia and I dashed after him, even as the eerie lights pressed closer. Through the slimy pools we raced. Dead, twisted branches tore at our clothing. Thick mud sucked at our feet. As we ran, the rancid air stung our throats and eyes. Yet we fought to stay close to the Ballymag, and ahead of the marsh ghouls. Suddenly the ground grew drier, though also less stable. Like a carpet overlaying a tarn, it seemed as much water as land, billowing and shivering with our every step. I tripped and nearly fell, but kept running. Our feet, like the Ballymag's claws, slapped against the undulating turf. His heavy gasps kept time with our own. All at once, the Ballymag fell silent. He was nowhere to be found. We halted, panting, uncertain what had happened. Had he fainted? Been captured? "Where are you?" I called. No answer came. I turned toward the floating lights, wavering unsteadily on all sides. Now they were almost upon us. The mournful wailing shifted into echoing peals of harsh, grating laughter. The voices rose, higher and higher, ready to drown us like an evil wave. Holia and I bolted, stumbling on the uneven ground. The lights were now so close that I could see my shadow fleeing before me on the quaking turf. Just as the marsh ghouls seemed to grasp us, we reached a darkened pool. We dashed across and instantly sank into deep, syrupy muck. We had no chance to cry out, no chance to swim. The ooze closed over my head before I could even take a final breath. I gasped, choking, as mud filled my nose and mouth. My last thoughts burned with rage and regret. That Holia, too, would drown. That my sword would never fulfill its destiny. That I, having come so far and sought so much, would lose everything down a forgotten pool in a forsaken marsh. Chapter 10. The Word. Mud. All around. Everywhere. The harder I struggled, the tighter it pressed, eager to swallow me whole. Soon it was all I could feel, sliding over my skin, filling my ears, pushing into my nostrils. Mud, thicker than any blanket, suffocated me. In the deepening darkness of my mind, I cried out to Holia, knowing she could not hear. "I wish you hadn't come. I am sorry, so very sorry." And to the powers of the cosmos, to Dogda himself, "Please, forget me if you must, but save her. Save her." A jolt, a sucking sound, then silence. I dropped deeper, thudding into something. Though my head still whirled, my body, it seemed, had landed somewhere. At the bottom of a mountain of grime, no doubt. Too much to move. My arm lay twisted underneath me, crushing my hand, but I lacked the strength to straighten it. I lay still as someone dead and buried. Buried by mud. Breathe. I needed to breathe. I opened my mouth, more from habit than from hope. I knew that I would only taste mud again for the very last time, and so I allowed myself to fill with air. I spat out some mud, forced myself to breathe, coughed, and breathed again. Slowly, my strength started to return. In the darkness, I rolled over, freeing my arm. Cautiously, I felt around with my fingers. I was lying on my side, upon something soft and flexible, bouncy to my touch. When I pressed against it with my hand, it pressed back, and when I pushed my nose into its contours, inhaling its rich aromas, it smelled wet and lush and alive. Scanning with my second sight, I traced the flowing, curving slopes that surrounded me. This could be a cavern, a crystal cave of some kind. Yet the walls of this cavern were so moist, so supple, that its crystals, I sensed, would be different from any I had ever known. Looking closer, I noticed the thin, delicate hairs, each one with a plum-shaped fruit at the top that covered every surface. Thousands upon thousands of them lined the walls, surrounding me, supporting me. I realized with a start that the hairs were moving, bending and swaying along numberless pathways. The hairs danced slowly to their own secret music. I felt as if I were inside a river, over whose surface flowed many smaller rivers, each one rippling, each one remarkable. And with their movement came warmth, a deep, soothing warmth that glowed without light, while welcoming the dark. Feeling whole again, I propped myself up on my elbows. Suddenly, a powerful spasm shook the cavern. The floor supporting me arched, tilted, and sent me sliding downward. I tumbled down a maze of dark passageways, gliding through countless turns, rolling over slippery flats, and sailing through twisting channels. The slick hairs lining every surface made it impossible to stop, and as my speed gathered, so did my fear. I bounced softly from these walls, as gently as a pebble rolling down a hillside of moss. But what lay at the end? I spread my arms and legs, trying to slow myself down, yet my speed only increased. All at once I broke through an opening, and into light, subtle and shifting. I landed on a springy, resilient cushion, covered with more fruit-tipped hairs, and bounced almost to the ceiling of a high chamber. When I landed, I bounced up again, and again, only gradually slowing to a stop. At last, I managed to sit up. Only an arm's length away, a round face peered at me. Half of it lay in shadow, and half in the quivering green light that rippled through the chamber. But I could not mistake those whiskers. The Ballymag! And behind him I saw another face, one I had not expected to view again. "Halia, you're safe!" "Yes," she said with relief. "As are you." The Ballymag snorted.
"Typical man-monster. Not even a single bitty kindless word of thanks."
I tore my gaze from Halia. Thank you, of course. If you hadn't known about this place—" I stroked the moist carpet beneath us. "Where are we, anyway?"
Questions ask, grumbled the Ballymag, patting the cushioned floor with two of his unfurled tails. In a while I answer speak, maybe see, but nowlessly, right moment for scrub-a-muck.
My brow furrowed. Scrub-a-muck? Halia's gentle laugh echoed among the glowing green walls. I think I know what he means, and I'd love to. I shot her a puzzled look, but she only grinned in response. Bracing himself with all 6 arms, the Ballymag closed his eyes in concentration. He took a deep breath, then started to hum a high, lilting melody, a melody that lifted, curled, and twined, even as his several tails did the same. As the song expanded, so did the light within the chamber. Stronger and brighter it grew, yet without any obvious source. Where could such light come from? The very air? The song itself? In a flash I understood. The tiny hairs themselves! Each one of them grew more radiant by the second, its fruited cap swelling with light. Meanwhile, the countless hairs continued to stream with motion, so as the walls grew more luminous, they also grew more textured. On every side they sparkled and flowed, pulsed and danced. This was, indeed, a crystal cave. Though very different from the one I sometimes dreamed of finding, yes, even inhabiting one day, it held a marvelous magic of its own, and it was so completely hidden, a surprising secret of the marsh. Might there, I wondered, be others? The Ballymag opened his eyes. His song faded slowly away, the echoes encircling us for some time. As he watched the light play across our mud-streaked faces, he released a grunt that showed no hint at all of satisfaction. Still, while it might have been just a trick of the light, I thought his whiskers turned upward ever so slightly, the hint, perhaps, of a smile. Then he set to work. Sliding close to one wall, he unfurled all his tails and spread them out like long, slender fingers. Holding them rigid, he brought them very close to the wall, but not so close as to touch it. He held them there, motionless, for a long moment. He seemed to be waiting for something, like a hawk poised to feel the slightest gust of wind on its feathers. Without warning, the remotest tip of one of the tails quivered. Slowly, ever so slowly, the motion spread down its entire length. Another tail suddenly bent, quaking along its middle. The other tails soon came alive as well. In a few seconds all of them were vibrating, shimmering in the dancing light of the chamber. In a single snap, the Ballymag whipped all the tails into the air. He started whirling them around and around, faster and faster, until they were only a blur of motion. In the middle, a glowing green bowl, larger than the Ballymag himself, began to form. The more rapidly the tails spun, the more solid the bowl appeared. An instant later, the Ballymag pulled back his tails. He deftly rolled to the side, just as the gleaming bowl dropped to the soft floor. Halia and I leaned over its rim and gasped in unison, for the deep bowl contained a radiant green fluid, every bit as dazzling as the walls themselves. "Liquid light," I whispered in amazement. "A bowl of liquid light." The Ballymag scowled.
"What's something else for a new scrub-a-muck?"
He heaved a sigh.
"Oh, pain o' woe, it's my curse of fate always ever have intruder guests, so stupid slow."
With that, he bent his back and threw himself into the air. He landed with a splash in the bowl. Completely oblivious to us, he splattered and scrubbed himself, humming as he did so. At last, he lifted his head, grunted, and pulled himself over the rim. He sprawled on the floor, glitteringly clean. Next came Halia. I turned away so that she could undress and bathe with privacy. And I twisted the Ballymag's head around so that he did the same. For several delighted minutes, Halia splashed around. When she finally emerged, she took a moment to wash her purple robe and the band of heather she wore round her wrist, and when she stood before us again, she fairly glowed. Nevertheless, I hesitated before taking my turn. Unsure what to expect, I cautiously pulled off my boot and dipped my toes into the green liquid. My shadow, even more hesitant, dallied at the edge of the bowl. Suddenly I felt a delicate thrill, like warm rain falling inside my foot. As I pulled off my tunic and leggings and climbed fully inside, I couldn't help but sigh with pleasure. Only then did my shadow finally follow suit, sliding itself into the bowl. By now my whole body tingled, not just my skin, but every particle underneath. My bones felt more sturdy, my muscles more responsive, my veins more pure. And the longer I stayed, the deeper the cleansing. Before long, every element of my being felt somehow renewed, scrubbed like never before. In time, I emerged and quickly rinsed my clothes, and also my staff, my leather satchel, and, though it gave me a pang to see it empty, my scabbard, studded with purple gemstones. I marvelled at how, despite all the putrid muck we had washed off, the liquid of the bowl shone as clear as ever. I dressed and gave the ballymag a slight bow. Whatever magic you used to fill that bowl, and us with liquid light, it was marvellous indeed. If I didn't thank you properly before, I do now. His tails curled and uncurled in unison.
Don't flatter Woomy, man-monster.
It's true, added Halia, leaning her back against the soft, glistening wall. You have great magic, as does this place. I've never seen or heard of a spot like this. To think it's right beneath that swamp. It's really the reverse of all that horror above, and yet somehow connected to it, too. I ran my open hand along the flowing contours of the floor. It's so lush, so verdant, so rich in here, like a garden. No, that's not it. More like a womb. Halia's eyes danced in the light. Yes, like being inside of a womb. I moved closer to her side. Even that doesn't quite describe it. Maybe it's just one of those things that simply can't be reduced to a word.
Wrong, foolish, grumbled the ballymag. There be a vereless perfect say word.
Annoyed, I glared at him. All right, then, if there is a word, what is it? The ballymag's whiskers lifted slightly.
Moosh lovely.
Part 2. Chapter 11. A Trail Marked Upon the Heart. We slept, nestled against the soft walls of the ballymag's underground home. When finally I awoke, however many hours later, I felt pinched with hunger, and painfully stiff in the tender spot between my shoulder blades. As I stretched my arms, Halia, who was already awake and seated next to the ballymag, handed me a thick brown roll. It was a leaf, stuffed with a doughy substance that smelled like a mixture of honey, nuts, and mud. Hungry as I was, I took several quick bites. The ballymag, his tails rhythmically coiling and uncoiling, watched me expectantly. "It's very filling," I said, trying not to offend our host.
"You thankously welcome, sir,"
he replied, proudly twirling his whiskers.
"This a treat came took from winter stores. Call it Gobblejoy."
Gobblejoy. I tried with difficulty to swallow my mouthful.
"And here taste for drink some."
Using 3 claws, the ballymag scooped up a wooden drinking bowl. He rested it on his prominent paunch, which protruded like a shelf.
"Make you easy time for gulp-chew."
I answered, still trying to swallow the first course. Halia took a sip from her own wooden bowl.
"It's like spice soup, but cold. Try it."
Taking the bowl, I peered into it cautiously. On the surface of the clear broth, I saw my own wavering reflection. My face, even my hair, had taken on the green hues of the walls around me. Then, bringing the bowl to my lips, I drank. A burst of cloves, or possibly anise, struck my tongue. Then marigold, the low-lying sort that thrives in wet turf, a strong flavour of mushroom, and delicate hints of singing rush and ginger root. Lowering the bowl, I looked approvingly at the ballymag. "Did you collect all the ingredients yourself, from up there in the swamp?" Quite suddenly, his customary look of fear returned. His eyes, glistening with green, narrowed slightly.
"Summertime soon short, they find come."
The coiled tears lining his spine flexed tightly.
"And killers scream horriblessly."
I shook my head. "Really, I don't understand." I turned my face toward the ceiling of the chamber, watching the waves of light flow over it like a waterfall. "Why do they want to kill us?" Halia, still sipping her soup, grunted.
"Because They are marsh ghouls.
No, there's something more. You heard that woman in the forest. They have never acted so viciously before.
Variously,
intoned the Ballymag, giving his whiskers a stroke.
But they plenty lots vicious, ma'am, now.
Putting down her bowl, Halia looked sullen.
The ghouls may be worse now for some reason, but they've always been the bane of the marsh. Even in ancient times, when my people made the trek to the flaming tree, even then marsh ghouls made sure that some never returned.
Flaming tree? I asked. What is that?
A wonder, she answered. A tree deep in the heart of the marsh that was always aflame since before the first fawn came to run upon this land.
Her steady gaze swallowed me.
Long ago, when Finkyron still wore their wings, the deer people were plentiful. So plentiful that we lived everywhere that grass could grow, even, it is said, on the shores of the forgotten island far to the west. Except for one place, this very swamp. But to prove their courage when they reached adulthood, every deer maiden and man came to this place all alone, and spent 3 full days by the flaming tree.
She frowned.
Even though the marsh ghouls only stalk by night, they still waylaid many.
Is that why, I asked gently, the rite was abandoned? Shaking her flowing hair, she looked down at the floor.
That had to do, my father told me, with the same wickedness that cost us all our wings. And while your kind was doomed to remember your fall by the ache within your backs, in the spot where wings might have sprouted, my own kind received a different punishment. For us, the flaming tree, symbol of our lost courage and freedom, lurks always in our dreams. Though many generations have passed since dear people trekked there, it is said that any one of us could still find the way, for the trail is forever marked upon our hearts.
Pondering her words, I worked my stiff shoulders. To my dismay, my shadow leaped away from me and started dancing across the luminous walls, turning cartwheels and somersaults, spinning as lightly as a blowing seed. Although no one else seemed to notice its gyrations, I knew that my second sight hadn't deceived me. That shadow, once again, was mocking me. I wished I could tear it away from myself completely. Yes, and cast it into the remotest part of the swamp. Halia lifted her head, just as the shadow leaped back to my side.
Now you can see why I'm not surprised by the marsh ghouls' latest behavior. They are terrible creatures, worthless creatures.
Worthless? I bristled at the word. Are you certain?
You don't know them.
I know enough. I pursed my lips. Long ago, in the most desolate land you can imagine, I was very nearly killed by a creature that everyone, including me, considered worthless. But later, when I had the chance to destroy it, I didn't, because I had discovered something about it that was valuable, truly valuable. Her eyes narrowed in disbelief.
And what creature was that?
A dragon. I watched her expression slowly change. The same dragon who became the father of Gwynia. She swallowed. Then, her face full of wonder, she gazed at me for a long moment.
Young hawk, you will make a fine wizard one day.
So I've been told. Still observing me, she began braiding her locks.
I didn't mean to upset you, but isn't being a wizard still your dream?
Yes, it's just that these days everyone else seems to see my dreams more clearly than I do. She paused in her braiding.
They're still your dreams, you know. Your visions of the future. You can change them if you want to.
I don't want to, can't you see? But the future itself, that can change. For years now, whenever I look into the future, what looks back at me is a wizard, and yes, a great wizard. That's what I see. Or at least what I want to see. I chewed on my lip for a moment. Yet, what if that doesn't turn out to be true? Maybe it was only a false vision to begin with.
Maybe it was, she replied.
And maybe not. With a sigh, I said, we should go now. Tying off her braid, she nodded in assent.
Suddenly, the ballymag leaped into Halia's lap. His eyes at their widest, he moaned, "No! Whoa! Whoa! Please! Make don't me, poor me! Risky come! Oh no! Whoa! Whoa!" "We won't," she answered, stroking his curved back. Gently, she entwined her fingers with one of his tails. "You've done enough for us already, and you have given us a gift we won't forget." The ballymag wriggled closer to her and gave a high squeak that echoed in the luminous chamber.
"Well, truth say is, you did do muchly well good to save help my life tender."
Then, with a glance at me, he clacked two of his claws.
"Though nearly you maim killed me, poor me, then after."
"My apologies." I extended my hand. "If we must part company, then let's do so as friends." The ballymag watched me cautiously. Suddenly, in one swift motion, he slapped his tail across my cheek, so hard I fell into the wall. Before I regained my balance, he had jumped off Halia's lap and vanished down a thin crevasse in the floor. For a few seconds, the sound of his body sliding through moist tunnels came back to us. Then, nothing. Halia, her eyes laughing, stroked my cheek. "Something tells me that's not his usual goodbye." I scowled. "He must save that for his dearest friends." For a moment we scanned the glowing surfaces, rippling with shades of green all around us. When again would we see a place so lush, so alive, yet so near to another place reeking of death and decay? Then, as one, we turned toward the end of the chamber, where a large passageway opened. From the movement of light, I could see that it angled upward. "That's our route, I think. Are you ready?" "No," came her hushed reply, "but I'm coming anyway." Together we entered the passageway. Soon the walls drew closer, and the ceiling bent downward, forcing us to crouch, and before long to crawl. In time, the green illumination of the walls began to fade, overpowered by the tentacles of darkness that probed ever nearer. The air grew rancid, heavy with the smells of things rotting. At one point, Halia hesitated, wiping her watering eyes with her sleeve. I started to speak, but her severe glance cut me off. An instant later, we were crawling again, moving upward into the gloom. All at once, both of our heads bumped into something. Hard, yet flexible, its slimy surface bent to our touch, like the peeling bark of a tree. It was, I realized, a slab of peat. Bracing myself against the wall of the passage, I prepared to push the slippery barrier aside. Halia, crouching by my side, squeezed my hand. "Wait, just a moment longer, before we go out there." Under my breath, I cursed. By the breath of Dogda, I'd rather not leave this place at all. I know. Down there, down deep, it's so safe and quiet and, well, complete. I haven't felt that way since long ago, when we sat on that beach together at the shore of my clan's ancestors. Do you remember? I drew a slow, thoughtful breath. The shore where the threads of mist were woven together. "By the greatest of the spirits himself," she whispered. "My father used to say that Dogda used as his needle the trail of a falling star, and his weaving became a living, limitless tapestry, containing all the words ever spoken, all the stories ever told, each thread glowing, richly textured, holding something of words and something else as well, something beyond all weaving, beyond all knowing." Listening to the echo of her words, I wondered about my own story, my own place in the tapestry. Was I a weaver, or merely a thread? Or perhaps a kind of light within the thread, able somehow to make it glow? One day, Halia, we'll go back to that shore, and to others as well. I pulled my hand from hers. Not now, though. Pressing my shoulders against the soggy mass of peat, I heaved. A A sucking, squelching sound erupted. At the same time, muddy water flowed over us, plus a new wave of odors, more putrid than ever. Sputtering, Halia crawled out into the swamp. I followed, dropping the slab behind us with a cold splash. Chapter 12. Too silent. Quiet lay the marshes, strangely quiet, like a heart at the very edge of beating. Gone were all the wails and moans, as well as the backdrop of pipings and creakings that we had heard before. Halia and I traded uncertain glances as we stepped into the swamp, our feet squelching loudly. Steaming vapors rose all around, tying knots of mist, churning endlessly. Judging from the vague light filtering through the clouds, it seemed to be late afternoon, though it could easily have been some other time of day. While I felt a surge of gratitude that at least some daylight brightened the swamp, keeping the marsh ghouls at bay for the moment, I knew that it wouldn't last long. Soon darkness, thicker than the mud on my boots, would return, as would the ghouls. We stood in a putrid pool, listening to the eerie quiet. The swamp seemed empty, a lifeless receptacle of moulding plants and debris, so different from the vibrant underground world we had left behind. For an instant, I recalled the tingling touch of liquid light on my skin, my forearms, my lower back, the soles of my feet. Then the memory vanished, replaced by the reality of muck oozing inside my boots. Halia stepped closer, sending ripples of slime across the pool. "It's so silent." Too silent. Concentrating hard, I stretched my second sight as far as I could into the swirling vapors, past the murky pool banked with peat, past the moss-splattered boulder where a lone crane perched, never blinking, ready to fly at the first sign of trouble, past the gnarled tree in the distance, tilting almost to the point of toppling into the marsh grass. The tree shone as white as a skeleton, with only a few shreds of bark on its trunk and a mass of dead leaves clinging to one of its branches. For the briefest instant, I caught the scent of something new. Unlike the rest of the aromas assaulting us, this smell was actually pleasant, almost sweet. Although it vanished before I could be sure that I hadn't just imagined it, the smell reminded me of blossoming flowers. Yes, that was it. Rose blossoms. Halia leaned closer. "Where do we go now?" Again, I tried to gauge the light. It seemed to be growing darker. I smiled sardonically, telling myself that at least for the time being I wouldn't be facing any more trouble from my shadow. What trouble we would be facing, though, I didn't want to think about. "Best we find some place to wait out the night." I pointed toward the leaning tree. "Over there, beyond that dead tree, is some sort of rise." "Dry enough to have no snakes?" "I think so. All I see growing there is some sort of shrubbery, dotted with berries, I think, red ones." Halia followed the line of my gaze. "Your vision is so much better than mine in this mist," she lamented. "I can't even see the tree, let alone what lies beyond." I sighed, stirring the murky water with my boot. The most important things that lie beyond, I can't see either. We started slogging through the muck, our footsteps echoing over the watery terrain. Rather than breaking the silence, our movement seemed to emphasize it, deepen it. After each step, the quiet took hold again, as if its own relentless steps were following just behind ours. Through the steaming pools we trudged, doing our best to avoid the decaying branches floating there. At one point, I saw hanging from a branch a single leaf that seemed to glow in the half-light. I paused to watch it swaying slowly, like a long-forgotten flag. Its fleshy interior had almost completely disintegrated, leaving only a delicate tracery of veins. Placing my hand behind it, I marveled at how much I could see through the open places, and yet how much of the shape of the original leaf still remained. How could so much of it be invisible and yet visible at the same time? Suddenly, I heard Halia groan. I whirled around to see her standing rigid, staring at something at the edge of a murky pool. Slogging to her side, my attention fell to a rotting, dismembered carcass that lay on the peat. What little of the hide remained showed tan and grey. A twisted leg, stripped of all its meat, stretched toward us, its hoof stained with blood. Halia groaned again and pressed her face against my shoulder. "A dear, poor thing. How could anyone have done that?" I merely held her, the image of the glowing leaf now replaced by the gruesome scene before us. In time, without looking back, we started to plod again. Once more, we heard nothing but silence apart from our own movements. But now it seemed clearly the silence of death. We crossed a mound of peat, which jiggled with our every step, then entered the field of marsh grass surrounding the tilting tree. Stiff stalks brushed against our legs as we approached the tree itself. As Halia leaned against its trunk, I stood beneath its twisted boughs, trying to find a path we could follow to the rise, and, I hoped, to relative safety. In time, I picked out a suitable route. Pushing aside some brittle grass that reached to my chest, I turned to Halia. Suddenly, the sharp cry of the crane echoed across the swamp. It lifted off from its perch on the nearby boulder, slapping the fog with its broad, silvery wings. Puzzled at what could have frightened it, I scanned the grasses, but saw nothing. Halia's eyes told me that she, too, was puzzled, as well as frightened. We stood rigid, listening. The beating of the crane's wings slowly faded away, swallowed by the silence. Then I thought I heard something else. Merely an echo of the bird's flight? No, this sound seemed closer, much closer, rhythmic, like shallow, ragged breathing. At that instant, something dropped out of the tree and thudded into my back. I fell face first into the grasses, splattering mud in all directions. Before I could recover, I was tackled by a wiry form shrouded in a mass of torn robes. Over and over we rolled through the muck, each of us vying for control. The layers of tattered robes made my assailant hard to see, and even harder to grasp. At last, I felt my arm wrenched tightly behind my back. A strong hand clamped around my neck. "Yield!" barked a voice. "If you prize your life at all!" Sputtering from all the swamp water I had swallowed, I couldn't respond. The attacker twisted my arm still harder, almost splitting my shoulder in two. Finally, I answered hoarsely, Yield!" "Tell your companion to do the same," he commanded. Quick as a deer, Halia leaped at us from the trunk of the tree. She ploughed straight into our foe, sending him careening into the marsh grass. I jumped to my feet and ran to him. Instinctively, I reached for my sword, expecting to hear the ring of its magical blade. Finding it gone, I cringed, remembering, and drew my staff instead. Brandishing the staff's knobby handle over the huddled figure, I growled a command of my own. "Now," I declared, "tell us your name." Halia planted a bare foot on one of his legs to keep him from wriggling away. "And why you attacked us." From out of the mass of torn robes, a face slowly lifted. It was not, as I had expected, the face of a warrior goblin, or that of a grizzled outlaw bent on harm. No. This face was altogether different, and altogether surprising. It was the face of a boy. Chapter 13. Hector. The boy stared at us, his face full of anguish. His cheeks, though smeared with mud, still showed a naturally ruddy complexion. Above his flinty blue eyes, yellow curls dangled, barely visible for all the twigs, bracken, and clumps of mud in his hair. His shredded robes hung from him like wilted petals, making him look like an elderly beggar. Yet he couldn't have been older than 12. Still feeling the ache in my shoulder, I waved the staff angrily. "Your name!" Well, he paused, licking his lips. "Hector, sir." Wriggling his leg under Halia's weight, he said, "And I didn't mean to attack you." I bristled. That's a lie.
Meant to attack, but not you.
He scratched his head, shaking loose a cluster of twigs, then gazed at me plaintively.
I didn't know you were a man, you see. I thought you must be a goblin, or something worse.
His brow wrinkled as he stared at my staff and the strange emblems carved upon it.
You're not going to hurt me with that, are you?
I straightened myself, rubbing my shoulder. No, though by rights I should show you the same kindness you showed me.
I'm sorry,
declared the boy.
Truly sorry. That was, rather rude of me.
Halia removed her foot from his thigh.
Rather?
I studied him pensively. There was something about this boy, despite my aching frame, that made me feel forgiving, that made me want to give him a second chance, even if he didn't deserve one. I shoved the staff into the belt of my tunic. I suppose I can understand your confusion, if not your brashness. This swamp is a bit frightening. Hector lowered his eyes.
That it is.
Extending my hand, I helped him to his feet. No need to fret, young man. Everyone deserves a chance to make a good, healthy mistake now and then. Giant's bones, I've certainly had my share. His lips quivered in a grin.
You sound like...
His words trailed off.
Like someone I know.
Well, I hope you don't greet him by pouncing out of a tree. The grin widened.
Only on Tuesdays.
Good. Let's call this Tuesday, so I'll have at least a week for my poor body to mend. He eyed me gratefully.
Tuesday it is, then.
The ways of men are strange indeed, said Halia. She stepped forward, her bare feet crunching on the stalks of marsh grass. Yet I will entrust you with my name as you have told us yours. I am Elo la Halia, though my friends know me as Halia. Tilting her head my way, she added, And this is young Hawk. I started to protest when she smiled at me and continued. He goes by other names as well, but that, I think, is his favourite. Softly, I replied, It is indeed. Hector nodded.
I am glad to meet you, Halia. And you, young Hawk.
I studied the boy's face, hopeful, despite the gathering gloom. Why did I feel this strange urge to help him, even protect him? After all, he had tried his best to pummel me only moments ago. Glancing up at the tree where he had been hiding, I wondered whether the feeling stemmed from my own memory of escaping as a youngster to the boughs of a tree, or whether, in fact, it stemmed from something else, something I couldn't quite fathom. Facing him squarely, I asked, Whatever brought you to this place? Are you lost? He pulled a soggy shaft of fern from his neck.
No, and yes. I came here looking for...
He turned aside.
For something I cannot name. I'd tell you if I could, really, but he made me promise.
Who did?
My master.
I lowered my voice a notch. Then who is your master? A sudden wind arose, stirring his tattered robes and whistling through the grasses. The dead tree, tilting precariously, gave a single sharp creak. Who is it? I asked again.
Well...
Hector bit his lip.
I can't tell you that either.
Halia cocked her head suspiciously.
You won't say any more than that?
Hector shifted nervously, splashing the murky water at his feet.
Well, I can tell you I'm lost.
How forthcoming, I said sarcastically. Meekly, he added,
I wish I could say more.
His blue eyes began to glisten.
Believe me, I don't want to spend another night, another minute in this wretched swamp. But now it seems I'm going to fail my mission, as well as my master. I just don't want to fail my word as well.
Taken aback by his sturdy sense of honour, I felt a renewed touch of sympathy. Keep your secrets, then. But if you won't tell us where you're going or what you're seeking, we can't be any help to you. The boy worked his tongue as if he were about to say something. Then, catching himself, he swallowed.
Then I must do without your help.
He tried to square his shoulders.
Would you, though, tell me just one thing?
It depends. He glanced worriedly at the rising vapours. The darkening mist churned, clutching at our legs, entwining about our arms. His voice a whisper, he said,
A few minutes before you appeared, the whole swamp went suddenly quiet. Hear it now. Not even a peeping frog, let alone some of those other, noises. That's when I climbed up the tree.
His youthful brow furrowed.
Do you know why it happened? What it means?
No, but I'd wager it means trouble. Hollia cocked her head, listening to the silence.
Feels like an enchantment to me. An evil enchantment.
Hector drew an anxious breath.
Perhaps, he asked hopefully, we could travel together for a little while.
I shook my head. Our work is too dangerous. If you stay with us, it could be your ruin.
And besides,
added Hollia with an edge,
we'd need to know more about you. Much more.
Sensing her distrust, I felt a pang in my chest. Yet as much as I was drawn to the boy, I knew she was right. What really did I know about him, except that he had jumped me from a branch? Resignedly, I extended my hand toward him. Good luck to you, Hector. He nodded morosely. Slowly, he lifted his hand and clasped my own. Despite his smaller size, he squeezed firmly, trying not to let his fear show through. In a determined tone, he said, All right, then. I've lasted a few days alone in this place already, and I can last a few more. Though I could tell he felt less brave than he sounded, I said nothing. He turned and strode off, his torn robe swishing against the grasses, heading in the opposite direction from the rise that had caught my interest. Careful, I called after him. Night will be falling soon. Without turning round, he waved a hand. He's one courageous lad, I muttered, watching him trudge away.
One devious lad, if you ask me.
Hallia's eyes followed the shadowy figure as he disappeared into the mist.
I think we're well rid of him.
Secretive, yes, I replied, but devious? I'm not so sure. It's true, he could be someone who can't be trusted, or he could be—
What?
Someone who just loves his master deeply. So deeply he'd do anything for him, even if it means wandering in this bog all alone.
She sniffed. Deer who can't share their true motives can't run together.
By now, no sign of the boy remained. I peered after him, but saw only veils of mist ever swirling. Then, gradually, I noticed a change. Not in the marshlands, which remained as still and silent as before, but in the mist itself. While I watched, its once fluid movements grew steadily more brittle. The clouds seemed to tense, their stillness of motion joining with the stillness of sound in the marsh. The next instant, a harsh, buzzing noise erupted. As the silence broke, the vapours started to swirl again. Hollia and I shrank back toward the tilting tree. The noise seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, from the vapours as much as the land itself. Slowly, it grew more intense, more jarring, and more loud. And with it, though I could have been mistaken, came the vaguest scent of something sweet as rose blossoms. Suddenly, out of the darkening clouds burst a swarm of enormous beetles, each of them as big as my own head. I had barely enough time to whip out my staff before they descended. Jagged, transparent wings sliced at the air, while sharp claws raked at our exposed skin. The beetles attacked from every angle, buzzing so loud that I could hardly hear my own thoughts. Swatting wildly with my staff, I managed to smash one as it dived at my face. Its purple armour, glinting darkly, flew apart as the beetle plunged into the muck. Hardly had I raised the staff again, though, when 3 more of them were buzzing me, clawing at my hands and eyes. Hollia shrieked, falling backward against the tree. A pair of beetles darted around her flailing arms, seeking an opening to her face. I turned away from my own attackers and swung with the staff. I felt a thud, and one of the beetles spun into the marsh. But there was no chance for elation. In just a fraction of a second, the other beetle would break through, and I had no time for another swing. The beetle dived at Halia. Its wings struck her forearm, cutting her skin. Blood spurted. She jerked her arm back, leaving half of her face exposed. Veering sharply, the beetle flew straight at her eyes. Suddenly, I heard a high, whizzing sound, then a splat, and the beetle exploded in the air, only a hair's breadth from Halia's face. Purple fragments of shell drifted down into the marsh grass. I whirled about to see Ector, his eyes alight, holding a rough-hewn slingshot. "Watch out!" he cried. A beetle's sharp claws scraped my ear. I shouted and swung my hand. The blow connected, knocking the creature away, right onto my chest. Buzzing wrathfully, the beetle arched its back, revealing a mammoth barbed stinger. The size of my fist, it lifted, ready to strike. At the same moment, several other beetles swarmed at me, pushing close, jabbing at my face. In desperation, I called to the deepest part of myself, the place most calm, even under such an assault, the place most primal and mysterious and close to the elements. "Air around us!" I cried, summoning all my will. "Throw them! Hurl them away! Far away from here!" A sudden gust whipped the air. Buzzing frantically, the beetles fought against the whirling wind. Their wings screamed, their claws sliced, but to no avail. The wind was far too strong, tearing them away from our huddled bodies. The beetle on my chest, clutching at my tunic, resisted a sliver of a second longer than the rest, and in that instant it plunged its stinger down toward my ribs. I winced, expecting to feel it pierce my skin, but to my shock and relief, the stinger halted just above my tunic. From its barbed tip flowed a thin gold line, as wispy as the thread of a spider. The thread expanded, flashing in the air as it coiled itself into a loop. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the loop melted into the folds of my tunic. I felt nothing. It happened so quickly I was not really certain what I had seen. Howling angrily, the wind tore the beetle from my flapping tunic. Swirling air bore the attacker, together with the rest of the swarm, in a frenzied mass over the marsh. Flying upside down, wings splayed or jumbled on top of each other, the beetles vanished into the fog. Their buzzing soon faded away completely. I felt suddenly weak. My legs buckled, and I dropped into a shallow pool of water. Marsh grass jabbed at my face, and I lacked the strength to brush it away. It was all I could do to remain sitting up. Halia rushed to my side. She lay her hand over my brow. "Are you hurt?" "Not seriously. I just feel weak." "You must have thrown all your strength into making that wind." Her voice, while gentle, seemed anxious as well. "You should rest a while." "That was quite a trick," Ector plodded over, kicking a half-submerged branch out of his way. "I'm not sure even my master, who makes his own magic sometimes, could have done that." Halia kept her gaze on me, but spoke to the boy. "And your slingshot, that too was quite a trick." She looked his way just long enough for her eyes to say thanks. "You didn't have to come back." Replacing the weapon inside his torn robes, he shrugged modestly. "I always enjoy a little practice with this thing." Weakly, I smiled at him. Halia stroked my brow. "I am worried, young hawk. You feel wrong somehow." "I'm fine. Just drained." Feeling a slight prick in my ribs, I remembered the beetle's strange behavior. Nothing worse happened than one of those beetles. "Stung you?" "No, not exactly." I pulled open my tunic. There, on my ribs, lay the loop of golden thread. Stretched flat, it was about as large as my hand. It quivered slightly on my skin, as if it were alive. Something struck me as odd. I hadn't noticed any hole where it had passed through my tunic. Halia gasped. The colour drained from her cheeks. Tensely, she reached her hand toward the loop. Her long fingers knitted the air as they approached. Just as she was about to grasp it, the golden filament stirred, twisted, and wriggled downward. It buried itself in my skin, leaving no mark. A jolt of pain shot through me. I cried out and clutched my rib cage. Halia's fingers scraped at my skin. All too late. The loop had vanished, working its way deeper into my chest. Chapter 14. The Blood Noose. The loop sank further into me. I could feel it melting into my skin, slipping between my ribs, and I felt certain, though I had no notion how, that it was heading for my heart. With all my concentration, I tried to muster the power to stop it. Yet, as drained as I was, I couldn't find the strength. Whatever magic I sensed instantly slipped away from me, faster than the very winds I had conjured. I couldn't stop the loop's progress, nor even, I feared, slow it down. All the while I could feel it working its way deeper and deeper into me. I gazed at Halia, her frightened eyes the mirror of my own. "What is it?" "I think it's what my father called a blood noose." Hector, bending over my chest, caught his breath. He ran a hand through his mud-clotted curls, frowning deeply. Blood noose. The very sound of the word made me shudder. I reached over to the leather pouch on my hip and tapped it. "Will any of my healing herbs help?" Halia's head lowered. "No. The blood noose, once inside you, moves rapidly. There's no way to stop it." She took an uneven breath and looked at me. "When it finally reaches your inner chest, it wraps itself around your heart. Then it squeezes tightly until—" "My heart splits in two?" She nodded, her eyes brimming. "I don't want to tell you what my father said about the victim's agony, just that, oh, young hawk, that dying is the better part of it." The curling vapours of the swamp thickened. The dead tree, leaning so close to our heads, seemed to withdraw farther and farther into the mist. Night, I knew, would come soon. Gently, Hector touched my ribs. "You are very brave. It must feel terrible." He started to say something else, but cut himself off. "I just wish I could do something." "Your slingshot," I said feebly, "can't do much for me now." Again he started to speak, struggled with his words, then abandoned them. All the while his hand remained on my ribs, anxiously stroking the skin. At length his agonized expression faded, giving way to one of resolve. "Wait," he said, fumbling in his robe. "This might help." He produced a small vial, burgundy in colour. Pulling out the cork, he carried it closer. A pungent, slightly burned aroma filled the air. Halia, looking alarmed, reached out her arm to block him. For a breathless moment, she held him in her gaze. "It's an elixir," he explained. "Something my master gave me, in case I got hurt on this, errand. He told me to use it only in the gravest peril, and warned that it can't outright heal a bad wound, but it could win some time, enough time, perhaps, to find a proper cure." Halia ground her teeth. "And if it doesn't work?" "Then he'll be no worse off." Another spasm of pain struck me. Groaning, I clawed at my chest. "Please," Hector urged me, "drink some. It might help." I peered at his earnest face. Even in the deepening darkness, his eyes glowed with youthful passion. No, I can't let you do that. What if you should need it later? For yourself?" He answered firmly. "I think it should be used when it's most needed." At last, Halia lowered her arm. The boy knelt in the shallow pool, bringing the vial to my lips. This time, I didn't protest. Very slowly, he poured the burgundy liquid into me. It tasted like charcoal from an old fire, but I kept swallowing, even as I grimaced. In a few seconds, the vial was completely empty. Even as Hector withdrew, a subtle thrill, like taking a first breath of crisp morning air, coursed through my chest. Upward and outward it spread, filling my middle with new, pulsing warmth. The feeling spread rapidly through my whole body. I felt lighter and sturdier. Fresh rivers of blood raced through my limbs. My fists clenched, feeling their former strength return. Halia smiled, wiping her eyes. She threw her arms around my head and held me, squeezing tight. In time, she released her embrace and turned to Ector. "We are grateful," was all she could manage to say. "Very grateful," I added. The boy grinned shyly.
"Just say it's an apology for what I did to you before."
I reached for my staff, half buried in muck. With a sharp tug, I pulled it free, though its top now bore a thick earthworm. Shaking the passenger loose, I grasped the gnarled top and clambered to my feet. I faced Ector. "Apology accepted."
"How long," asked Halia, "will your elixir last?"
His expression clouded.
"I don't know, but I have a feeling it's not very long."
Taking my hand, Halia probed me with her gaze.
"This is your chance, young hawk, to save yourself. Come, leave your sword for later. With any luck we can find our way out of this marsh before the chance has flown."
I looked down at my empty scabbard. Even in the dim light, the purple gemstones glittered. It was the scabbard of a magical sword, the sword of a wizard, and a king whose reign shall thrive in the heart long after it has withered on the land. "No," I said, my hand tightening around hers. "I can't do that, especially not now. Halia, there's something wicked, utterly wicked happening in this marsh, unlike anything that's been going on before. And my sword is only part of it. I know that now, as surely as I know your face. What it really is, I can't quite name, but I have the strange feeling that it's something I've met somewhere before." She pulled her hand away.
"You can't do much good if you're not alive. If we can just get to Care Prey, or your mother, the healer, they might still be able to save you. Then you can come back here if you choose."
"It may be too late by then." Her eyes narrowed.
"Whose expectations are you trying to meet, young hawk?"
I sucked in my breath. "My own." She frowned at me, her eyes full of doubt. Leaning on my staff, I scanned the steaming decay surrounding us, and I noticed for the first time that the sounds of the swamp had started to return. Over there, a strange bleating, and there, a deep-throated burbling. A series of low, moaning howls echoed across the marshlands. Soon, I knew, they would be joined by other sounds, and by other things. "Come," I declared, "we need to find shelter before nightfall." I nodded at Ector. "And by we, I mean to include you. Will you travel with us?" Thoughtfully, he rubbed his chin.
"For a time."
Halia brushed my chest lightly with the back of her hand.
"And does we still include me?"
"Of course. That is, if it's what you choose." She blinked her round eyes.
"It's what I choose."
"Then let's go." I pointed toward the bush-covered rise, now just a dark hump against the background nearly as dark. Let's hope those shrubs are thick enough to hide us. I started off, followed closely by the others. Stretching my second sight as far as I could, I led them through the marsh grass to a narrow mound of peat that wound its way through the thickening fog. At one point, we passed a pile of loose, jagged stones whose cracks revealed a pair of thin, yellow eyes that watched us closely. Cautiously, we moved past. Though the peat, unlike the softer mud around us, didn't suck at our every step, it remained wet enough to form tiny pools of water in our footprints. Once, as I paused to wait for the others, I watched the string of watery prints behind us gradually fade away. In a moment's time, they melted into the land as completely as one spiral of mist melts into another. At the edge of the peat mound, I spotted a twisted vine with curling leaves. Nearly buried in the mud at its base lay a squarish vegetable, reddish-purple in color, that seemed quite familiar. Suddenly, I remembered the time I had seen and eaten one just like it. My mouth watered. How marvelous it had tasted!
Even so, I hesitated. What if it wasn't really the same vegetable? In the end, my churning stomach prevailed, and I reached over, plucked it, and placed it in my satchel. As we pressed ahead, the rise grew more prominent. Drawing nearer, I realized that what I had taken for shrubs covering it were actually low, densely branching trees. Their trunks, where they showed at all through the mass of branches, looked as stout as giants' toes, their bark as deeply wrinkled as my own leather boots. What had, from a distance, looked like red berries, I saw now were the red undersides of their leaves. At the end of the winding mound of peat, we came to the edge of a wide, slimy pool. Even in the gathering shadows, I could tell that it bubbled and stirred ominously. Crossing its dark green expanse was surely the shortest route to the rise, but I didn't particularly like its look or smell. Still, with night fast approaching, going straight across could save precious time. Cautiously, I tested its depth with my staff. It seemed shallow enough. I stepped forward. Although fluid seeped into my boots, the bottom held firm, seeming slippery but passable. I traded glances with my companions, then took another step. Whatever I stepped on moved, slithering into the reeds at the pool's edge. I jumped back, but lost my footing. With a splash, I landed on my side in the slimy water. Then, to my horror, I felt something wrap around my leg. It hardened like a flexing arm, then pulled me deeper into the pool, dragging me downward. "Something has me!" Halia and Ector leaped to my aid. They grabbed me by the arms and tugged hard. Whatever held me, though, tugged back. Ector's boots slipped on the peat, causing him to fall to his knees. Still, he kept pulling. Halia's braid lashed her shoulders and back as she twisted this way and that. At last, I broke free. We toppled backward, falling in a heap on the soggy ground. For some time, we just lay there, panting, while thick vapors curled above our bodies. Finally, I shook the mud from my hair and sat up. Noticing the slick black ooze that covered my lower leg, I scraped away as much as I could with the base of my staff. Wordlessly, we helped each other to our feet and set off again, working our way around the pool. The last light faded swiftly as the swamp noises swelled around us. Fog swelled, opening into dark mouths with shifting teeth and vaporous tongues. Dead branches caught on our clothing and scraped our shins. Yet such obstacles did not concern me, for I had noticed an eerie glimmering at the edges of my vision, a glimmering that grew stronger by the minute. At last we reached the rise. Although not very high, it was, as I had hoped, drier than the surrounding marshes. But my heart sank. There was no clear pathway to higher ground. The thick stand of trees formed a tight mesh of branches, so closely woven that even my second sight could not see past the outer rim. Only a few gaps in the growth gave glimpses of the woody tunnels among the trees. Tunnels. The idea made me start. Perhaps we could still find shelter here after all. Halia grabbed my shoulder. "Those lights! They're coming this way. It's the marsh ghouls, I'm sure." An eerie, anguished shriek arose from the marsh. It was followed by another, and another. "Come quickly!" I darted to the trees. Stepping over the burly roots, I led the others to a narrow gap in the branches. "Careful now, these thorns look murderous." More of the chilling cries rose behind us as we ducked into the narrow tunnel. Instantly, darkness overwhelmed us, along with the scent of fir cones, sharp and sweet. The tunnel bent to the left toward the center of the stand, then right, then left again. Whenever it forked, I chose the most difficult passage, hoping it might afford more protection. As I crawled deeper, thorns ripped at my tunic, stabbed at my knees, neck, and shoulders. Behind me, Ector gave a shout of pain. More than once, Halia's fist pounded the ground like a doe stamping angrily with her hoof. We reached, at length, a wide place in the tunnel. 4 or 5 of the gnarled, grooved trunks surrounded us. The ceiling of thorns was too low for us to stand, but left plenty of space for sitting or kneeling.
I guessed that we had arrived near the center of the cluster of trees. I leaned back against one of the trunks, licking a cut on the back of my wrist.
"Well, here is our accommodation for the night."
"I've had worse," offered Ector, pulling his robes around his battered shins. Halia curled herself like a fawn in a hollow among the roots. "Yes, this will do fine." She touched my thigh. "How are you feeling?"
"Well enough."
"All we need," said Ector in the darkness, "is a bit of supper." Remembering the vegetable, I pulled it out of my leather satchel. A bit crushed though it was, its skin remained intact. I broke off a section, brought it to my nose, and smelled. At once I recognized the robust aroma, as rich as meat roasting over a fire. "What's that smell?" asked the boy.
"Our supper," I replied.
"It's a vegetable used by the bakers in Slantos far to the north to make one of their special breads. I found it in the marsh." Halia slid closer. "Do you trust it?" I broke open the juicy vegetable, then licked my fingers.
"I'm too hungry to doubt, and besides, I could never forget this smell."
Handing each of them a section, I then proceeded to extract the wide, flat seed from the center. Even in the dark, my second sight glimpsed its deep red sheen. Placing it on the ground, I struck it with the base of my staff, cracking it into pieces. These I distributed around, but not before popping a few into my own mouth. As I chewed, the bits of seed burst apart, exploding with flavor, as well as something more, something that made me feel that I would, in fact, regain my sword and live to wield it once again. Good flavor," commented Ector, a river of juice dribbling down his chin. "The bread must be wonderful."
"It is," I replied. "The people of Slantos say it can fill your heart with courage."
"I like it more and more," said Halia, chewing avidly. "That's what we really need." "Right," agreed Ector, breathing a heavy sigh. "Courage to face the future." I handed him another section. The future can be frightening, can't it? "In a place like this, most of all, young hawk, where every step you take means choices, hard choices." He took another bite and chewed thoughtfully. "So, whichever path you choose, it's bound to be partly right and partly wrong."
I nodded. Life itself often feels that way to me. Unfamiliar trails shrouded in mist so thick you can hardly see what choices you really have. I swallowed my own mouthful. I suppose all you can do, all any of us can do, is try to do the best we can.
"Despite the mist?" he asked plaintively.
"Despite the mist."
"But what if—" His words trailed off. "What if the choice before you is clear, but it's simply impossible? Say you're trying to help someone, maybe someone you love a lot, and yet if you succeed in helping him, it means that you can't, well, help someone else, someone who also deserves to be helped. What do you do then?"
Stretching out my hand, I clasped one of his ankles. "I don't know what it is you're searching for, Ector, or who it is you're trying to help." He stirred, at the very edge of speaking, but held himself back. "And yet," I went on, "I can tell you one thing with certainty. Whatever difficult times the future holds in store for you, this thing will never change." My voice deepened. "You have helped someone beyond any doubt on this day, and Ector, I will never forget it." Silently he nodded, even tried to smile. Yet underneath his face remained grim. While I could tell that my words had touched him, they hadn't lightened his burden as I had hoped. Could it be, I wondered, that he knew something more about the future than he could reveal? At length he placed his smaller hand on top of mine. "I'm glad you found these trees, young hawk, and I'm also glad you found me." For a long moment we said nothing. In time,
I lifted my arms toward the ceiling of thorns, trying to stretch my back. I suppose we should try to sleep a little. Trouble is, I don't feel sleepy.
Nor do I,
he agreed.
Nor I,
whispered Halia, shifting her weight among the roots.
Especially with all that wailing and howling, muffled as it is, going on out there.
For me, I confessed, those sounds aren't as troubling as...
The blood noose? She asked sympathetically.
Yes, cursed thing. I can't help but wonder when the elixir is going to run out, and what that will feel like.
What we really need, suggested Ector, is a good story, the kind that can take your mind off, well, everything else.
I know a gifted storyteller, I volunteered, someone who grew up in a clan whose life is rich with all manner of tales. I nudged Halia's thigh. Would you?
Yes, please,
echoed the boy.
Would you?
She drew a long, slow breath.
Well, I suppose.
For a moment she looked at the ground, thinking, before raising her head again.
All right, then, she said at last. I shall tell you a story famous among my people. It is the story of a girl named Shalia, and it is a tale about mist, about friendship, and about choices, impossible choices.
She sat, legs crossed and hands resting in her lap, gazing at the wall of branches. It seemed, by her expression, that she could see right through the sheltering trees into the swirling clouds beyond. Then she began, her voice as smooth as an evening breeze by the sea. Hear me now, for I shall tell you the tale of the Whispering Mist. Chapter 15. The Tale of the Whispering Mist.
By a faraway shore, on a faraway sea, the mist rises nightly from star-shining waves. Over the darkening sea it spreads, stretching thin, wispy fingers out to the land. And on this night, as on so many nights before, the mist reaches first to touch a single place, a single rock, the rock still remembered as Shalia's stone. For there Shalia came often. Legs dangling from the rock's edge, she would sit hour after hour, to watch the sun plunge into the sea, or the stars swim like luminous minnows through the eel-black sky, to feel the first curls of mist touch her toes, and above all, to listen to the slap of waves and the cry of gulls, to the spray of whales heaving breaths as deep as the waters themselves, and on some nights to another sound, unlike waves, unlike whales, a mysterious whispering that seemed almost alive. The whispering somehow made her recall her youngest years, her gladdest years. Although she had never known her mother, who had been taken by the gods of sea and shore while giving birth, her father had stayed always near. How they had laughed when they leapt into the waves, uncovered clams together, and chased each other through the pools of flashing fish at low tide. How they had lived utterly one with the waves and themselves. Until that day, it had all ended. The memories drowned, like her father, after he stepped on the spines of a poisonous spikefish hidden in the shallows. Taken in by her grandmother, Shalia moved to a mud hut at the outskirts of the village. She had no brothers or sisters, no friends her own age. Yet as much as she longed for companionship, she kept to herself. She felt no room in her heart for anything but loneliness, and the unending longing to sit by the sea. "Don't stay all alone by the water," her grandmother warned, "especially at night, for that, my child, is when the sea-ghouls come closest to shore." Sea-ghouls, the old woman explained, lived in the shadowy realm between water and air. More dangerous than a circle of spikefish, they could take any shape they chose, much like the mist itself. They could drive people mad, and often did. Many were the tales of villagers who, lingering too long after dark, had been lured into the waves by sea-ghouls. carried off by the currents, they were never found alive, or never found at all. Only their footprints in the sand remained, fading with the moonlight. Charlia had heard all the stories, but she had also heard, much more clearly, the faraway call of the waves. How could that whispering, soothing enough to wash away her grief for a while, be dangerous? Just to think of closing her ears to that sound made her feel sad, more lonely than ever. And so every night when her grandmother slept, Charlia stole silently down to the shore. Every night she sat there, watching as liquid darkness poured into the great bowl of the sea. Sometimes she closed her eyes and imagined her mother and father returning to her, stepping out of the shallows. Or a true friend, someone who knew her so well that they would need no words at all to know each other's thoughts. Yet she knew these were only dreams, no more real than her grandmother's tales. One night, Charlia followed the full moon's path down to the sea, stepping over broken shells and shards of driftwood. As the turf gave way to sand, a huge wave slammed against the shore, pounding like thunder. Slowly, the wave withdrew, sloshing over the reef. Charlia saw that her rock, wet with spray, glowed eerily. She climbed onto a barnacle-covered seat. Moonlight sparkled on the waves. Mains of mist streamed from every crest. The briny breeze tousled Charlia's curls, and she shivered. Not so much from the evening chill as from something else, a feeling she couldn't quite name. Part uncertainty, part hope, part dread. She gazed at the open ocean. Tonight, the mist churned even more than the water, forming into wild, phantom-like shapes before shredding again into nothing. She saw a moonbeam strike a spiral of mist, revealing, for half an instant, shapes within shapes, shadows within shadows. And always, from somewhere out there, the continuous whispering swelled and faded. Then, a dark, lumbering mass of mist gathered in the distance. Charlia watched, her heart racing, as it started to rush toward shore, toward her. The whispering grew louder and louder, drowning out the surging sea. She tensed. Should she leap off her perch and run back to the hut? But her fingers only clutched the stone more tightly. The dark mass approached, leaning into the land. Great, writhing arms protruded from its face, reaching out, stretching toward Charlia. The whispering became a rumble, the rumble a roar. Suddenly, the whole mass stopped. Mist hovered over the lone girl, embracing her, quivering slightly where its edges melted into the air. Yet the mist came no closer, never touching her, just as it never quite touched the beach. At the same moment, the full moon's light cut through the vapours. There, deep within the curled arms of mist, Charlia saw other arms, more delicate, more wispy, more like her own, with elbows and hands and long, slender fingers, fingers that moved. One misty hand, shimmering with moonlight, reached up to comb strands of flowing silvery hair. Then a shoulder appeared, a neck, and a face, the face of a tall, glistening girl standing inside the mist. Charlia started, almost tumbling off the stone. In response, the mist maiden turned sharply, placed her hands on her hips, and gazed through the vaporous window that separated them. Her eyes, gleaming like starlight on the waves, fixed on Charlia's. For an instant, the whispering ceased, as if the sea itself were holding its breath. All at once, the mist maiden threw back her head and laughed. Although Charlia couldn't hear her voice, she clearly felt her mirth. In her own bones, in her own veins, in her own mortal flesh. And then Charlia, without thinking, did something she had not done for a very, very long time. She laughed out loud. The Mist Maiden nodded her head, raining moonlight on her shoulders. As she placed a silvery hand upon her chest, the whispering resumed, swelling into a sound like Malasha. Slowly, her skin tingling, Charlie arose and stood upon her stone. Malasha, she repeated. Then, touching her own chest, she uttered her own name. Shalia, echoed the mist. With a sweep of her hand, as graceful as a wave rolling over a reef, Malasha beckoned toward the beach. Shalia hesitated briefly, then clambered down from her perch. As she stepped on the coarse, wet sand, she left deep footprints in her wake. Meanwhile, Malasha moved in the same direction, always staying within the wall of mist, leaving no footprints at all. Walking parallel to each other, the two girls followed the shoreline. Shalia sensed somehow that her companion could not leave the shroud of rippling vapours, just as she herself could not move beyond her own, more solid world. Yet even though mist and sand